got the subject, he drives quickly, he drove, over 50 miles an hour into it, going towards the subject. And unfortunately, that wasn't the subject was right here. He passed the subject as he went. So that's why some of the confusion early on. Now, the doctrine for active shooters is clear. I mentioned it before. And it's two sets of it. Hey, you stop the killing, you stop the dying. The other part of that doctrine is you isolate, you distract, and you neutralize. Everyone's taught this. You require it in T-Colt training. We practice it, we preached it. This is the doctrine, and it recognizes that you run to the sound of gunfire. When you get to gunfire, you don't stop. Okay, when you get there, you run into gunfire, okay, and it's so important to do so. And I'll tell you what, and I've said it before, and I hope I underscore them. There's no doubt in my mind that those officers would have gone, any one of them would have sacrificed their life for those children. Any one of them. If they knew there was kids in that room and teachers in that room, I have great confidence that those police officers, those local officers, would have done what was right. 1140, we have chief, first report, officers contained in the office. Contained is not a word for active shooter. Contained is a barricaded subject. Contained is a situation where you may have a hostage, you need a SWAT team. Okay, you have time. The C's, first you contain, then you communicate with the subject, then you call for SWAT, then you create an immediate action plan. That's not what this was. This was never anything more than an active shooter situation. But at some point, he's contained in the office. Then we have Chief Ariano calls Uvalde PD. It has been reported he did not have a radio with him. He did not. That was actually true. That was correct report. And this is the conversation that he had, and you can read it yourself in your notes. But all this for purposes of this. Chief Ariano, hey, it's Ariano. Can you hear me? I'd like to tell you where we're at. It's an emergency right now. I'm inside the building. Where this man has an AR-15. He shot a whole bunch of times. We're inside the building. He's in one room. I need a lot of firepower, so I need this building surrounded with as many AR-15s as possible. Can you hear me? The dispatcher responds. Can be heard talking in the background and asking what room number. The chief. Is the teacher with him? Is she in the room as he's in? Can you hear him? Ma'am? Dispatcher, I'm right here. Chief, ma'am, is the teacher with him in his classroom? Dispatcher, she's in another classroom. She's in room 102. Another person possible shot across from her. It wasn't in 102, it was 112. Is the accurate number. Chief Ariano, okay, we have him in the room. He's got an AR-15. He's shot a lot. He's in the room. He hasn't come out yet. We're surrounded, but I don't have a radio with me. Please let all units know he's going to be in a room. He's in room 111 or 112, and we're in here. I'm in the hallway. Sergeant, another sergeant are here. We need this place surrounded, and if you have SWAT, I need them to set up south side of the building, which is the nearest to the location to the funeral home. Dispatcher confirms SWAT location. Chief Ariano, yes. They need to be outside the building and prepared because we don't have enough firepower. Right now it's all pistols and he has an AR-15. You can get the SWAT team set up by the funeral home, okay? And we need, yes, I need more firepower in here because we have pistols and this guy's got a rifle. So I don't have a radio. If somebody can come in, the dispatcher, Chief Ariano, but I am going to drop it when he comes out of the door, all right? So I need you to bring a radio for me and give me my radio. For me, I need to get one rifle. Hold on, I'm trying to set him up, or set him. I'm going to set him up right now, okay? Do me a favor. Call me when SWAT is set up. I'm going to have you a vibrate, though. Call me twice if you have to. It's okay, all right, thank you. Questions have been asked about who's in charge. And much to the chagrin to some, that when people believe and what they hear, that when the FBI shows up, no, they're not in charge, okay? When other agencies show up, you're not in charge. It's the agency that has the original jurisdiction is in charge, but you have options. Just because you're in charge and you have the authority and you're the ranking official, senior official on site, you can actually delegate that down. In my case, the lower I delegate it, the better in terms of sound decision making, or you can delegate it to another agency, or you can ask another agency to take the lead. This is common practice in ICS, in Incident Command. We practice that in Texas. We always practice it. We preach it. We're very careful, and you'll find when you talk to the experts in the alert training program, as self-deploying is a risk. Deciding who's in charge, deciding it on your own to take action without it being properly coordinated is a risk. It's one of the challenges you have in these type of situations. But nevertheless, in terms of if you're going to issue commands, okay, if you're going to direct action, you're the ranking official from the agency that has jurisdiction, you're the on-scene commander. Gunfire happens again at 11:40. Let's assume that was a barricaded subject. He was contained. Well, he fires again, and he's room 111 or 112. It's not reasonable to expect that there's children and teachers in that room still alive. 11:41, Uvalde PD officer. We believe that he's barricaded in one of the offices. They're still shooting. More misinformation. He's not barricaded in an office, okay? He's in a classroom, 111 and 112. Dispatch asks if the door is locked, to which a Uvalde PD officer replies, I'm not sure. We have a hooligan to break it, a hooligan tool, so you can just break the lock and move in at the door. At 11:41, 4 first responders in the room from the east hallway. We had 2 constables, a fire marshal, and UPD officer. So officers continue to flood into the particular area. So we had 11 to begin with. We've had another 4 officers to it. The DPS trooper was the first DPS officer to arrive.
Director McCraw, we've got to ask you this.
Yes.
Best you can, speak into the mic.
Oh, yes, sir. I apologize.
So the system can pick it up. If you
Yes,
could
sir.
pick that mic up, that would be
Yes, sir.
great.
All right. How about that, sir? Does that work?
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Chairman. At 11:42, we had a DPS trooper and 2 PD officers enter from the east hallway. She was there less than 2 minutes, looked around because at that point in time there's multiple officers, and she left the building to find other duties as assigned. 11:44, another suspect fired around. 11:44 later, UPD officers have some officers there available to get everybody back. UCISD officer Ruben Reese, and one of our sergeants, Sergeant Maldonado, actually drove Officer Ruiz to the scene. He enters at that point in time. An unknown officer says, they need to get out of the hallway. Well, before I need to talk about Officer Ruiz. He notes that she's been shot. He's talking about his wife. He got a call from his wife. His wife was in room 112 and later died. Unknown officer says, they need to get out of the hallway, to which an officer responds, Chief is in there. Chief is in charge right now. Hold on. 11:51, 7 Border Patrol agents enter the west door. There had been a call earlier for BORTAC, and BORTAC was en route. These aren't BORTAC agents that first responded. At 11:52, there's a first ballistic shield that enters the west door. At 11:52 later, UPD officers, units just showing up, can you help with crowd control? So officers after 11:52 are being diverted to crowd control activities. 11:53, unknown officer informs a DPS special agent that they need right now is a perimeter. Someone comments on whether there are still kids inside, to which the DPS special agent responds, if there is, then they just need to go in. Someone comments about whether there are still kids, in which he responds, if there is, then just need to go in. He enters the west building and is directed on where the suspect is focused on. This is from a body camera, and you'll note that any information that I'm using right now, it came from, it's color-coded, so when it's blue, it's body camera. Obviously, from video surveillance, it's either whether it's funeral home and indicated, and of course the Uvalde PD recordings as well. And you have that in your booklet. After some time, the DPS officer, said, "Are there kids in there? We need to go in right now." Then he said, "What's that?" Then whoever's in charge will determine that, because of what he recommended, if there's kids in there, we need to go get them. And then later on, the DPS agent, he left the scene to look for kids, found a young boy in the restroom in the west building that was hiding, and then went outside to search other classrooms. There's a PD channel recording. Again, it's critical that let the PD take the point. 11:58, after an unknown officer was asked where the shooter is, another unknown officer advises the school chief of police is in there with him. There's a 911 call at 12:03, and that's the call from Chloe, the first time Chloe calls. And of course, it's heart-wrenching to listen to her. She's in room 112, okay? She was actually the only child in room 12 that was uninjured. Okay, there was 8 children killed, 2 teachers killed in that room. And of course, she was uninjured. 9 children were injured in room 112. 12:03, the second ballistic shield enters the west door. 12:04, the third ballistic shield enters the west door, and yet there's no action. 12:09, PD officer, go around and get the master keys to the room. Elements of the BORTAC arriving at the elementary school was at 12:09 or 12:10, and I think the first BORTAC members went into the building at 12:15. During that time, the Uvalde ISD Ariano requests master key. Uvalde ISD Chief Ariano gives instructions to officers to have a sniper on the east roof. Master key, there's more than one master key for the west building. Anytime the locks were changed, there was another master key for that lock. So you may find a master key, but there's 2 master keys. You've got to get both master keys. So there was some frustration in the discussion about this master key doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work because that master key is not for that door. (12:16), USD chief says, "I just need a key." The chief says, "Tell them to expletive wait. No one comes in." 12:20, the fourth ballistic shield shows up. At 12:21, importantly, the suspect fires 4 rounds. So if this is a barricaded subject, why is he still firing? Oh, thank you. The chief says at 12:28, let me back up to 12:21. Can you get a breaching tool like a trailer house, like for a trailer house? The chief, we've lost 2 kids. These walls are thin. If he starts shooting, we're going to lose more kids. I have to say, we have to put those to the side right now. Uvalde chief attempts to communicate with the suspect in English and Spanish. Now, the entire communications was always one way. The suspect never communicated, so it was not communication. We're talking at. But an officer, there's a teacher shot in there, to which the Uvalde PD officer replies, "I know." The chief, people are going to ask why we're taking so long. We're trying to preserve the rest of the life. The chief, do we have a team ready to go? Do we have a team ready to go? Have at it. It's at 12:27. 12:28, the chief. There's a window over there. Obviously, the door is probably going to be locked. Probably going to be locked. That is the nature of this place. I'm going to get some more keys to test. 12:28, the chief. These master keys are working here, bro. Aren't working here, bro. We have master keys and they're not working. The chief at 12:30. Okay, we've cleared out everything except for that room. We still have people down. They're just past the flag to the right. But we're ready to breach, but that door is locked. 12:33. The chief. I say we breach through those windows and shoot his expletive head off through the windows. This is an hour and a half, an hour after you entered the building. An hour after you entered the building. 11:35, a hooligan tool arrives. to the west door. At 12:38, the chief attempts to communicate with the suspect in English and Spanish. At 12:41, the chief says, just so you understand, we think there are some injuries in there. And so you know what we did, we cleared off the rest of the building so we wouldn't have any more besides what's already in there, obviously. 11:42, the chief says, we have an expletive problem getting into the room because it's locked. He's got an AR-15 and he's shooting everywhere like crazy, so he stopped. 12:43, Uvalde chief, they got to get that expletive door open, bro. They can't get that door open. We need more keys or something. 12:46, the chief says, if y'all ready to do it, you do it, but you should distract him out that window. 11:47, a sledgehammer enters from the east hallway. At 11:50, the breach and termination gunfire. At the time, there was a stack of 7 officers that went in. Actually, only 4 went directly in because the door closed, as will happen in some of these operations, and left the 3 out. 3 entered thereafter, shortly thereafter. 5 officers fired rounds at the subject, killing the subject at that time. Chairman, that concludes the timeline. And of course, I know that you may have some questions on the door and other questions that I'm ready to discuss right now with some of the pictures that we have. And I thank you for the opportunity to have gone through that.
Okay, so you're ready to get some questions now?
Yes, sir.
I've got a couple, and then we'll open it up. You said the outside door was unlocked.
Yes, sir.
Now, was that lock, as I understand it, there at one time was a rock, the teacher removed the rock, the teacher closed the door or heard slam the door. We don't know really what all to believe because we've heard so much stuff. But was the door closed and did the lock just not work?
The only way you can lock these exterior doors in the west building, there's 4 doors. One is for the library and 3 other entrances, east, west, and south. The only way to do that is from the outside. You can't do it otherwise. So when she knocked the rock out, it closed securely, but there's no way for her to tell that the door was unlocked. The only way to know that the door was unlocked is go out, close the door, okay, then try it. So that's the only way you can tell on this particular model.
But he came straight through the door with no problem.
It was unlocked. He walked straight through it.
So did y'all check the lock later to see if the lock was malfunctioning, or was it working?
Yes, the locks were working fine, and that on the exterior doors, the locks were working fine. Now I can tell you, looking at the picture here, you don't need a key to get into this building. It could have been locked. This glass doesn't have mesh on it. All you have to do is shoot through this glass. Okay, reach in, there's a bar. Well, here's a bar. Pull that, and you're in. Now, the subject would have known that. He would have known it. And the same thing, these panes are also vulnerability.
Yeah, anybody can look at that and tell it'd be easy to take a gun and shoot holes in it and reach it around.
Yes, sir.
But the first question was, the lock was functioning correctly?
The lock was functioning correctly, and the door was unlocked. It was closed, but unlocked.
I thought when it closed, it was supposed to automatically lock.
Well, you can set it to two sections, and it's similar to the actual door on the interior as well. You can turn it all the way one direction. It's unlocked. You can turn it another direction, and it's in the lock.
Okay,
position.
so the latch was working functionally.
Yes, sir.
Well, it was just turned in a position when you close it, it doesn't lock.
Exactly. Someone did not lock that door.
Okay.
And similarly, the south door, which I described officers going in early on, that door was unlocked as well.
Second thing, okay, you may have just said what I was fixing to ask, but the classroom door, was it locked or not locked?
The classroom door, if we can get a picture of it, I think this one is probably the best example if you don't mind. This isn't the actual door. Well, this shouldn't really. This is the actual door, but we don't want to use that. This is room 127 and 126. That's what 111, this 112 and 111 would look like in that regard. And here's the door. You cannot lock this door from the inside of the classroom. There's nothing the teacher could do to lock the door inside the classroom. The teacher can come outside the classroom as the requirement is to lock the door with a key, only with a key, and this right here by turning it, and to the locked position. And I can actually have the door of another, this came from the west building, one of the doors right here, and I can demonstrate that if you'd like at this time, Mr. Chairman.
So the teacher could not even lock the classroom door from the inside?
That's correct. There's no way to lock the door from the inside, and there's no way for the subject to lock the door from the inside.
It was open.
We had heard reports that the lock was malfunctioning, that they had turned in a request for the lock to be fixed. Is that all fictitious? Or
we had a locksmith inspect the lock and the strike plate. The lock was functional. The strike plate was not. What's not happening is, so as you can see on this door here, is that, yes, the lock was working as it was designed, but if it doesn't, if the through doesn't get into the strike plate, it may be locked, but it's not secure. You can just open it. And that's, so it can be the locked position, ironically, in the locked position or unlocked position, and it's still unsecured and can be opened.
Okay, so there was never a request to have a lock fixed?
There was evidence that the requests were made about that lock based on an interview with the teacher and also some reports that we found of submissions to have it fixed.
So a teacher thought the lock was broken?
Yes, the teacher was convinced it was unlocked and it was broken and reported it earlier.
And was that request made like days before the shooting, or weeks, or months?
I think I can't say. I'd have to go back and get the exact timeline. I don't have that right now. Chairman, I'll get that back to you in the committee, exactly what days that were requested that they would be fixed.
On the officer's radio, I heard he went in without his radio, then he obviously was requesting his radio.
Yes, sir.
But I was told later, or maybe by you or someone else, that the radio would not actually function inside the school.
Yes, sir.
Because it did not have the strength to reach out of the school.
Yes, sir. We conducted a threat and vulnerability assessment of the site while we had control of the school. And our DPS special agents brought in our communications team, and we conducted tests of everybody's portable radio, Uvalde PD, Sheriff's Office, Border Patrol, DPS, everybody's portable radio in that west building. And the only portable radios that worked in that west building were Border Patrols. Okay? They were the only ones that worked.
All right, so we've got a police school officer whose radio will not work inside the school.
That's correct. Yes, sir. And nor would the PDs, okay? So if they're responding to assist, nor would the sheriff's office if they're responding to assist, and nor will DPS officers if they're responding to assist. The Border Patrol has a station there in Uvalde, and that's why they had so many agents in the area. And of course, they've got a stronger, boost on their particular tower. I can tell you that even when we take Border Patrol and we were able to link them and patch them all together, then even Border Patrol's radios didn't work.
Okay, I've got Senator Zaffarini raised her hand first. Senator Zaffarini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel McGraw, you talked about different stages of this tragedy, starting with the shooter's social media messages, his communications with people, including the young woman and the young lady in Germany. And you talked about communications. You talked about the communication among the officers, the radio communications and others. Looking back specifically at all of those areas of this tragedy that you have addressed, what is it that we must change going forward? What lessons have we learned that we could implement going forward?
And one thing we did early on, Senator, is recognize that it would be better if the Department of Public Safety was asked to do the investigation. It was far better that we enlisted the expertise of really active shooter situations, and fortunately Texas has a nationally recognized experts at the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Program at Texas State University. and they have well-known experts. And we asked them early on while we had control of the scene and provided them information to please let them do an assessment, okay? The tactics were employed, where the breakdowns occurred, and make recommendations, okay, in terms of other options that could have been used at that point based upon the facts of this particular scenario and options going forward. Moreover, we also requested that the School Safety Center conduct an audit, an assessment of the school safety and compliance with rules and regulations that relates to the requirements that have been laid out by the Texas legislature. And well, as I just mentioned earlier, we conducted our own threat and vulnerability assessment, not unlike what DPS special agents did for the University of Texas campus in the aftermath of that brutal attack on a co-ed, and also at Texas Tech University at the request of the chancellor. So we did that same thing at that location, and of course we came away with recommendations. From that, we made that available to the Commissioner Morath, and we met with him last week. The team met with him last week and went over the assessment. It's a preliminary assessment, the draft, but there's some clear things that need to change, and I know that he's always looking for ways to improve, and those have been provided to the Commissioner, and I can discuss some of them if you would like.
That's exactly what I want, some recommendations.
Sure. The perimeter. First, the campus perimeter fence is inadequate to prevent threats from accessing the campus, period. Okay, just I mentioned a 4-foot fence. It's tubing, very easy, very lax. There's gaps in it. There's a lack of controlled access points. And as you know, the Capitol, we use what? We use these badges, right, to badge in. And the advantage if a teacher leaves or if a student leaves, you can deny them access to come back into it, and you can control access, and you can see when people enter and exit. So that's an advantage. Plus, it's a locking mechanism that's more secure than what we've seen, especially when the defects would be detected easier and earlier. A lack of card key access, we just mentioned, controlled, I just mentioned, but lack of controlled access points. The access points and the entrance gates are not controlled, and they do not guide visitors to one location. Now, this didn't make any difference in this situation, but it is a concern was brought out. The exterior doors, as mentioned, do not have strike plates installed to protect the bolt or latch from prying or picking. There are no deadbolts installed on the exterior doors to strengthen them. Rocks and other debris were removed from the area around the door, painted rocks they had throughout the campus along those lines to let people back in. Exterior door inset glass panes, which I showed before. I mean, obviously, this is like a no-brainer. Someone can go through that at some point very easily. And of course, within arm's reach, if you take out the window, then you're able to reach your hand and do it. Now, ironically, in the interior classrooms had web inside this interior pane that you see, and the exterior doors did not, so it was tougher. You can still take them out and put your hand in and open the door. It doesn't mean you can't get it out. You absolutely can. The subject could have, but he didn't need to in this particular case. The classroom doors are vulnerable to all classroom doors being accessible from the hallways once in the building. This is further enhanced due to the fact that the access to the campus is not controlled. The classroom doors are vulnerable to attack, and some of the locations of classrooms outside doors, there's as many as 40 doors across, I believe 8 buildings on that campus. But some of those are like mobile units that they open directly out, and there's access to those mobile units from the outside. So if you get inside, the perimeter, then immediately you can access that. You're right looking at a mobile, and essentially a mobile unit, and you can drive around campuses all over the state and see these because of the growth of students, and they expand. So now you got an access door, an access issue, especially if you haven't controlled the access around the campus that would allow anybody to go up to that particular door. They have adjoining classroom door, and I didn't mention it specifically, but there was an adjoining door. Okay, that's how he was able to get easily between 111 and 112. It facilitated him, but could have facilitated action by law enforcement. So between 111 and 112, the door was, we believe, unlocked because it was always kept unlocked because teachers will watch their students for someone else's students if they're out of the room at that point in time. So and even if not, it's easy to breach that particular doorway. And there's 2 doors adjoining the room. A knock box We heard a lot about keys. Where are the keys? Where are the keys? Well, a knockbox, is a secure safe where campus or building master key is kept, for first responders. And if we had it, you may have 3 master keys, but they're all in one place. A duress system. There was no duress system throughout the campus, and the lack of it, linked to a mass alert system with redundancy features, which is recommended. A mass alert system can immediately alert the entire campus via multiple notification platforms. Now, they have a Raptor system and they did. The principal, they sent messages out and hit teachers. It went to everyone along those lines, but it's not the same as a duress system. Emergency evacuation diagrams. We found red bags are left in rooms. And in that red bag, one of the things you'll have is a diagram of the campus. And the advantage of that is you can look at, so if you're a first responder, you have that immediately. Oh, this is what it looks like right here, right now. You don't need blueprints. You don't need to. The challenge was some of those diagrams are wrong. I mean, some were correct, but some are wrong. And one of the ones that was wrong was used to look at and say, hey, what about a sniper location? Well, if you look at it, it looks like the library covers the windows. In the back, and would eliminate a sniper position. So and that's an example that why it's important to have the diagrams correctly. Emergency response communication enhancement system. That goes back to the radio communications. There are systems, and we saw it after 9/11, when we had officers and firefighters that were killed in 9/11 because they couldn't get communications. They couldn't talk to them because of the concrete and walls, glass, and things like that prevented communications. And there is a way to expand or enhance communications by taking the signal, okay, and increasing that signal through antennas on campus in that regard. That'd be just some of the things. And again, the experts are going to be school safety center, not the department, as it relates to the school. But that's our things that we saw immediately based upon this campus, and this particular event that we identified and had discussed it with the commissioner.
We all know that there are areas where there is not adequate service.
I'm sorry?
We all know that there are areas where there is inadequate service for telephones, for radios, et cetera, specifically cell phones.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
What can we do to ensure that at all of our schools, we do have enough power to ensure that there is effective communications among people who have cell phones, among people who have radios?
Well, cell phones did work, obviously, inside the school. So the cellular backbone was sufficient in Uvalde that day. That's how the chief communicated with the dispatcher. That's how Chloe called 911. That's why the teacher called. So cell phones worked. It's just the portable radios that first responders had didn't. And the irony of ironies. But and of course, the only thing you can do, either a new radio system, because their system was really not designed or wasn't designed as needed for the requirements in terms of school safety or this situation and others. Either replace it, or going back to what I talked about before, there's a way you can buy, or a technological solution that you can expand the signal inside the school, and that can be done.
But for example, that relates directly to Uvalde. And what I'm trying to do is see what we can learn from Uvalde, from that horrific tragedy, to ensure that we address the problem statewide.
Well, every school should be evaluated for that. There should be, and I know that, and there'll be other people that will testify, including some great professionals, city chiefs and ISD chiefs that will be testifying, and what they're doing and proactively in that regard. But if you're going to do active shooter training, it's always best we do it together, okay? It's always best to do it at a school location where there's no kids. And it's always best to check the whole system, not just in terms of how you respond together as a team, but communicate as well. And of course, there's no reason why we can't test all those radios, okay, to make sure everybody's radio operates inside a school. And for that matter, large public buildings.
And that's my point. For example, if you're in a school that is right on the border, yes, you might look at your cell phone and see a message that says, "Welcome to Mexico." Yes, ma'am. And the service in Mexico takes over. It is more dominant than the service on the American side.
We haven't fixed operability, let alone interoperability, in some places along the border and other parts of Texas where there's not the cellular backbone or infrastructure to support communications.
Would you agree that that is something that we need to look at and make recommendations about?
Absolutely.
Regarding social media, the shooter in Uvalde did have specific social media messages and did communicate directly with persons about what he intended to do. What responsibility do we have to monitor social media and to intercede when something like this is evident or at least threatened?
Well, the evidentiary ones, the ones that were of concern that would certainly generate action, were done through messaging and not like posting. So these are messaging, sometimes four-person chat on Snapchat and Instagram, or sometimes it was gaming platform where multiple people were talking in that regard. Those messages require a subpoena, okay? And so what was concerning is that no one brought it to the attention because people, even some people were getting messages, were concerned and sometimes blocked the subject from communication. So, it would have been better if they had alerted somebody instead of just blocked a particular subject in that point. So that requires the public to be able to proactively report that. That said, in the end, there's so much data, okay? I can't even describe how much data there is, as you know it very well. So the only ones that are able to have the expertise and resources, whether if there's algorithms that are developed to identify threats, words that are key words, and of course that gets into privacy, that is provided to law enforcement as a threat to life or suspicious at that point in time. And that's where you're going to have the debate, privacy over, okay, the saving of lives. And there's very smart people in the social media environment and business that in high tech that can, there's no doubt in my mind, they can develop algorithms to figure out what you'll buy or what you want to buy by a moment. They can certainly identify algorithms and develop things that will pare it down to that entirely suspicious wordings and groups of wordings like school shooter, for example, a clue, okay, that those things are somehow at least brought to the attention where law enforcement has a chance to at least get a subpoena and go before and try to get some of that information.
Many years ago, only certain individuals with specific relationships with a child who was abused were required by law to report that child abuse. This legislature passed a bill requiring anyone who knew about child abuse to report it. Do you believe that we should consider a law like that, requiring anyone who knows about threats like this to report it?
Well, obviously policy is well above my pay grade and something for you and the governor, but I can say that certainly would help because, people, if we can't do it and require it, at least to the extent we can educate people that, and what's concerning is that some of these things are group things. It's almost like they're talking to each other, that they support each other. This is cool, neat, a part of this deviant subculture, whatever you want to call it in that regard. But it always gets somebody's attention, and they stop, or they block, or they get out of that messaging. All it takes is one report. It might give us the opportunity. And obviously that didn't happen in this case. And unfortunately, every time you go back and look at one of these tragic situations, you see opportunities that we had to be able to stop that pathway towards that violence.
Thank you. There are investigations underway, and we have heard so much conflicting information about what happened, when it happened, and by whom certain actions were taken or not. What hope is there that the families who were so negatively impacted, so horrifically impacted in Uvalde, will one day get the truth about exactly what happened?
Well, I can tell you this, that there's not a major investigation I've been involved in my entire career with the department and with the FBI that initially we don't know. But yet there's a crushing demand for information. So you provide information with provisos. It's preliminary, hasn't been corroborated, but nevertheless, you're reporting information. And that information ends up being misinformation a day later or 2 days later. Now, the advantage we have is in the position we're in right now, and that's why we're very careful today. We're not going by witness statements, okay? What we're doing is going by physical evidence that we've collected, that we've reviewed, frame by frame, that has been enhanced, that we looked at. So everything I've testified today is the facts. So the family can rest assured that information is correct, plain and simple. If we change the number, for example, I think I said there's 420 rounds of ammunition in the truck that was left, or 900 rounds in the backpack, or at the end of the day, the subject had over 186 rounds on him. If the number changes to 185 or something like that, I think the public would understand. Or it's 899 and it was rounded off. But everything I've testified today is corroborated just by the areas in your book. Will show you exactly where that information came from on that timeline.
Thank you. In 2019, this legislature passed a bill requiring public school districts to include an active shooter emergency response plan in its multi-hazard operations plan and active shooter trainings for school district peace officers. In 2021, we passed another bill requiring school board members to take a course about school safety. So both of these bills were passed and should be in effect. I'm sure you are familiar with those two laws and more. Are the laws that we have passed working, or which do we have to go specifically look at again and improve them? For example, those regarding active shooter training.
Well, I'll say this, that, well, obviously not enough training was done in this situation, plain and simple, because of bad decisions, terrible decisions. Terrible decisions were made by the on-scene commander and should have never happened, plain and simple. Now, I can say the state of Texas has already, been leaders in the forefront, its legislature and its leadership, and when it comes to school safety. An active shooter, I mean, you've got the nationally recognized Center of Excellence for, before active shooter training is at Texas State University. It's funded by the state and the federal government as well, and works in partnership with the FBI. School Safety Center. They don't have other school safety centers around the nation in that regard. When you implemented it, was the idea that we can look at all the things, so they have plans in place, look at vulnerabilities and those things, and a checklist of things to do at schools in that regard. At the end of the day, the post-Santa Fe thing is what can we do to prevent, on the front end. We talked about the pre-attack, okay? The only thing, if you make it, that's where your success looks like, when you can stop it before it happens. And you address that in the post-Santa Fe and provided it. I can't tell you that, and they won't like me saying it, and I might get some of my accounts banned, but at the end of the day is that, I'm as a law enforcement professional, I'm disappointed in the social media industry for not being more proactive, and I understand that they got a business model. Privacy is important. If the people think there's not privacy, they may lose money. I get this. But I just certainly believe that I have great confidence in their resources and their capabilities and their acumen and technology to be able to identify solutions, okay, that can help identify, potential threats, okay, and bring that to the attention of law enforcement. And use it through, have judicial controls in place. Make sure it's not Big Brother, but that give law enforcement an opportunity at least to identify suspicious activity and act upon it.
What recommendation would you make to this committee to include in our report from the perspective of the head of the Department of Public Safety? If we were to ask you to name one recommendation that we would adopt, what would that recommendation be?
Well, we need to train more. And I'll say this from a DPS standpoint, just from the director standpoint. One thing I want to make sure that we're never in a position when we show up, because more often than not, when we show up, it's a supporting role. I mean, most of our resources were, in Eagle Pass, in Val Verde, in Del Rio, Webb County, for example, in your area. So we got as quick as we could get there. We got there, okay. But we want to make sure that when we show up, it doesn't matter where. In Santa Fe, we had 2 troopers right in there with the chief, one taking a shot at the shooter. Okay, we want to make sure they have the equipment that they need. And one thing that's keep recurring thing that's just this disappointing over and over, that we have to have shields. No, you don't, but you know what? Why not have one? So we want to put a go bag in every patrol car in the state. And in a go bag, we want to have a ballistic shield, not a SWAT version, not full body, enough to cover the face in that regard, and breaching tools, and train them on the breaching tools. So, well, everyone, right now, our breaching experts are going to be on our SWAT teams or special response teams. That's where our breaching expert is, because it's usually used for search warrants and stuff. I want every trooper to know how to breach and have the tool to do it when they show up. So we're not just supporting in terms of having an officer on the scene. We're also bringing equipment that may or may not be needed, but at least we have it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kokorst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director McCraw, at the beginning of your remarks, you were very defined in the characteristics of the shooter. You went through his age and different things. I have a couple of questions on that. You mentioned animal cruelty. That's been talked about a lot. Was there Did he commit animal cruelty, and was anyone aware of that?
First of all, this is where I get to digress and say, based on interviews and not on physical evidence, the reports that he was involved in cruelty, animal cruelty, particularly cats, walked around with a plastic bag of dead cats. And there was other information, okay, the reports. None of that was brought to the law enforcement attention. It's a crime in itself, but it's another key. You know, I didn't include it on the timeline, didn't include it in terms of the suspicious, because it's not, we're depending on witnesses telling us this after the fact, but clearly it was, we believe, I'll say this, I believe as of right now that he did engage in, okay, animal cruelty, and of course that's a part of the pathway, okay, to become individuals involved in, you know, suicidal, fatalistic, and certainly animal cruelty is something to look for.
You did not mention a toxicology report. Do we have a toxicology report?
No, autopsies have not been, we don't have the report, the final report yet. The medical examiner is doing will do the final report.
And do you believe
on all the individuals involved? And the district attorney is also recognized that it's appropriate to have additional expertise. I think she's enlisted the support of well-regarded medical professional.
At this point, no toxicology report on the shooter.
That's correct. Yes.
And then of his characteristics, was he a gamer? Did he?
Yes, he played Fortnite with friends at school and friends, other locations that he found online.
First-person shooting games?
I can't tell you exactly what games he played.
And then truancy. I've seen different reports on how long he had been truant. Are you aware of how long he had been truant?
I know that he hadn't completed a lot of the curriculum, and he was well behind. It's been reported as far back as a sophomore when he left his what would be normally a junior year. But I believe that TA could do a better job in terms of answering that question in terms of truancy. I can tell you that we've yet to find anything in his files, disciplinary files, anything that you would expect to find with somebody with this type of background. We just haven't found it.
And then to your timeline, you talked about the door. Mr. Chairman, you asked some questions. I want to clarify and make sure that I heard this correctly. The classroom door that he entered, did I hear you correctly say that the lock was broken, that it did not?
The lock was not broken. Okay, the strike plate was dysfunctional, and the only way you can get it to lock is from the outside is lock in the lock position, and it's nuanced, and that's why we brought one of the doors in the lock position, and then pull on it and get it to seat, the throw to seat in the lock plate. Well, if you can do that, then it would be locked, okay, or I'll call it secured. It would be secured at that time.
So while there was a lot of time lapse in your timeline, waiting on a key, and there's a lot of the communication that you have transcribed. The fact could we ascertain here or conclude that there was never a need for a key because the lock was not working? The swipe plate was not working properly.
I don't believe, I don't believe, based on the information that we have right now, that door was ever secured. In fact, I have great reason to believe it wasn't secured. The subject doesn't just walk in, as I testified before, then shoot the classroom, walk back out of the hallway, then walk back in again seamlessly, okay? And he didn't have a key, and he couldn't lock it from the inside. So the door was unsecured, and we've gone back and checked in our interviews, and did anybody touch the door and try it? How about, do you need a key? Well, one of the things they teach you in active training, I'm sure that one of the experts can talk about it, how about trying the door and see if it's unlocked? Okay, what we used to call a clue at that point. Why not? And of course, no one had. And so even if you're part of the breaching team, and we've gone back and talked to them, and they've been led to believe that it's locked, even they, when you go back and talk to them, they didn't try the door, they took the key. As you can do the key, it'll open it, okay? Whether it's locked or unlocked, it will take the throw and put it back into the door, and you move it, and you can walk, and you go right in. So that's
So out of lessons learned, what we would conclude from your testimony today would be that no one tried the door. There was a lot of time waiting for a key, of which a dysfunctional door was never locked because the shooter was able to walk in and, as you say, go back and forth.
Yeah.
Finally,
But moreover, though, you didn't need a key, okay? There's tools, and the alert program, and you'll have some experts testify, I think sometime today, they're going to be here. We had them go in and see if they could breach, and you can talk to them what they figured out, what they can do, how long it took. But the point is, you don't have to wait for a key, and shouldn't have to wait for a key to breach. And they'll talk, I'm sure, windows. Windows are great access points. And oh, by the way, you're protected.
and my last point of clarification on your timeline, from 11:28 and 25 seconds, the suspect crashes vehicle. We've heard lots of different reports about how long he was outside. He obviously, I heard, how many shots did he fire outside before he entered at 11:33, which is 6 minutes and 35 seconds according to my
He
math.
fired 3 rounds at the funeral home. Okay. He fired another 24 rounds while outside of the West Building in 2 different classrooms as he walked towards the door.
And did those bullets enter the classroom?
Yes.
They did not harm any children in those particular...
There was 2 other victims that were injured. It was a teacher who was shot in the stomach, and it was a teacher, and it was a student. They were in classroom 109, but the rounds came, rounds came from room 111 into the wall, through a classroom and into the classroom that they were in, which is 109.
None of the bullets from the outside harmed a child, but they did penetrate into the classroom.
Some children were injured, but we're talking about penetrated bullets. But the only ones that I've talked about were the 2, the ones that I've already mentioned.
Thank you, Mr.
Oh, and we need to probably say that the only time we found rounds that officers fired was in room 111, at the time of the breach.
Okay, I've got a number of members that are indicating to me they want to ask a question. Let me just say, I think everybody has their lights on and is requesting. So I'm going to start with my vice chairs. So Senator Creighton's going to be next, and then we'll take it by seniority all the way down. Then I have some of the non-members who would like to ask some questions once we're all finished. All right, so Senator Creighton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I think I can get through my questions fairly quickly. Within 3 minutes of the shooter entering the school, it says on the timeline here provided that 9 officers entered the school within the 5-minute mark. No, within 3 minutes of the shooter entering the school, 9 officers were in the school with rifles. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I mean, there's as many as 11, shortly thereafter, with 2 of them had rifles.
And so Chief Arredondo, incident commander, as it stated, said many times through the audio that the officers in the school only had pistols. What is the discrepancy? Which is fact?
2 officers had rifles. And so there was never a need for rifles. I mean, the 3 initial UPD officers that arrived, but thereafter there was, anywhere from 11, and the numbers kept increasing, and the number of rifles kept increasing over time.
So even though there was never a need for rifles, Chief Arredondo kept saying, we only have pistols, we need rifles. Why is that? What in law enforcement training would lead him to continue to say that over and over?
Well, first of all,
as if that was a necessary factor to advance.
Well, first of all, as a commissioned officer, you don't need a rifle. You have a gun. There's a reason you have one. You have body armor. So it's going to be risky. Officers, and Chief Arredondo was right. I mean, officers are likely to get hurt, and some may die. but it's less likely that they would than children without the armor, without the weapons, without the training, left alone with someone that had already brutally killed, at least at that time, we don't know the timing of it, but ultimately killed, 21 people.
So just to be clear again, within 3 minutes of the shooter entering the building, 9 officers were in the hallway with pistols and rifles. And within, at the 5-minute mark, Chief Arredondo was heard saying, he's contained in this office. Is there an office on the floor plan that you provided as an exhibit?
Not that I'm aware of. It's as referenced in the particular rooms. There's a janitor room, there's a restroom, but there's, I don't know, it's not an administrative building, these were classrooms.
So in a school within days of a summer break, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that kids were in the classroom when making decisions about determining whether or not it's an active shooter protocol or a barricaded intruder protocol?
It's more than reasonable to assume that there were children inside those classrooms, room 111 and 112.
There's many references by Chief Arredondo about the door being locked and needing keys and more keys and a master key and just constant references to keys. But is there any evidence whatsoever that shows through the video as it was examined later that the door was ever, that there was an attempt to open the door or test whether or not it was locked?
We could never see anybody put their hand on the door, and of course up until the breach. And then at the breach, we've gone back and talked to the breachers, re-interviewed the breachers, and they said no, they didn't try the door handle beforehand.
And then there's a reference to a sledgehammer and a hooligan, and those are separate.
Yes, sir.
And then, so was there any reason within your experience with in law enforcement training overall why either the door wouldn't have been checked as to whether or not it was locked, understanding there's gunfire, but with a hooligan and with an available sledgehammer, what would be a reason why the door would not be checked, and why would Chief Arredondo keep referring to the fact that keys were needed through the minutes and what it ultimately ended up being 77 minutes of delay?
Yeah. Well, respectfully, Senator, one of the reasons we wanted to have an outside independent review by subject matter experts is so they can answer those types of questions, because then it becomes my professional opinion as opposed to what's consistent with doctrine. But I would suggest that doctrine, I'll go back again, is very, very simple. Okay, you don't wait for a SWAT team, right? No time for a SWAT team. If you got one officer, that's enough, right? So you don't have to wait for 11 or 12 or 50 or 30. You got one's enough. If you got to, you're there in the scene, you got an obligation to go and immediately engage the shooter, okay, and stop the shooting and really stop, which is really stop the killing, because there could be other ways to kill it, and then stop the dying. That's preached, practiced, and required in the state of Texas. It just wasn't implemented.
And the assumption in a school where the shooter's determined to be in one of two classrooms, the assumption being that children would be in those classrooms, I find it hard to believe that why in any way would there be a reference to the shooter as a barricaded intruder in an office when it's not even on the floor plan?
Well, I'm not sure, I don't know why. I can just tell you, certainly in the fog of battle, things, get confusing along those lines, but that's why it's important to have some things are unambiguous in terms of what the doctrine is. And I know that, just from my experience, hey, windows are an option. We saw in Santa Fe how effective, getting on the scene quickly was for an officer, even though he was seriously wounded, and the chief being right there, and of course, engaging the subject to these pains, because the pains work against you, but they work for you too. It provides you an opportunity And the experts will be able to talk about how they can quarter a room and you can look at it and wait for the suspect. So there's things you can do to protect the kids in the room, and that's why they say, in terms of, we'll isolate is a word, and of course, distract. Things that can distract. I mean, obviously, if you're simultaneously hitting the windows, okay, in room 111 and 112, is going to distract the subject when you go in. It's human nature. It's practiced along those lines. None of that was considered. The only thing that, at the end of the day, like I said before, we waited for rifles, we waited for a radio, we waited for a SWAT team, we waited for shields before the SWAT team. There's always some reason why we didn't go in. And of course, the result was 1 hour, 14 minutes, and 8 seconds. And in an active shooter environment, that's intolerable.
And I just want to make it clear for the record and for those listening that when you say we, and you've been very out front on your efforts to help participate and find the answers in this investigation as to what protocols were followed from the ABC News interview just a day or two after the shooting to being before this committee today. But DPS was in no way involved with either being incident command or with making decisions on site. You are just providing testimony today as to the agency's part in the investigation. Is that correct?
Well, let me put it this way. We sent substantial resources immediately to the scene. We even had a 20-man SWAT team and a 10-man SWAT team headed that direction. They didn't make it in time. So we're always going to flood resources into an area. By nature of where we are, where we're stationed, we didn't get there. The first officer was able to enter that west building was 11:42. That time there was numerous officers, and sometimes more is not better. In the hallway, more is not better. Okay.
But there was an established incident commander when your officers arrived.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. But I want to make this clear too. This is when I say we is the law enforcement community. And when one fails, we all fail, plain and simple. I mean, and that's, it's something important. So take responsibility. It's easy when I appear to be hypercritical of the on-scene commander, and I don't mean to be, but the facts are the facts. Mistakes were made. It should have never happened that way, and we can't allow that ever to happen in our profession. This set our profession back a decade. Is what it did.
I appreciate your explanation on that and the way, the rhetoric that you use. It's very much appreciated. At the 19-minute mark, the first ballistic shield was brought into the school. Can you just, for the benefit of the committee, describe not only how the ballistic shield is used, but what kind of gunfire it can take at what proximity, and would that shield, one shield with an unlocked door, been enough to advance and take down and neutralize that shooter at that 19-minute mark?
You never needed a shield, okay? For an active shooter, you don't have time for a shield. So the 19-minute mark, it arrived, but it was always called for. We have it on the timeline because it was called for. In fact, eventually 4 shields arrived. Now, I can tell you they're different rated. Some are rated for rifles, some aren't. But I go back to it, and at the end of the day, you got to get in there, plain and simple.
I guess the point that I'm trying to make is, and you've mentioned several times, you don't need the shield. There is no excuse for not advancing on the active shooter, and we all agree with that. But at that next interval, when a shield was even present, I'm just asking, at what point, how many gateways of excuses were there to not go in and save those kids that were still alive? If a shield would have been used to advance on the shooter, what would it's difficult because Chief Arredondo is not here today. So I'm trying to gain perspective in a way that I can understand the thought process of someone that made several decisions with the resources that he had not to advance into the classroom, take the shooter down, and save the kids that were still alive or that were wounded.
Well, I know. Well, first of all, I don't like singling out a person and shifting and saying he's solely responsible. But the end of the day, if you assume incident command, you are responsible.
I'm just starting with the commander.
Yeah, I'm kind of backing my way into it because I hate being in that position to do it, but it is what it is, number one. And by the way, even when the rifles were there, okay, not just two, but more, many, when the radios were there, and radios never worked anyway, but when the shields were there, and not one, two, but eventually four, when the first elements of SWAT got there was always a reason to wait. Then it became the key. So there's always something that laid it. And the time, I'll keep emphasizing, 1 hour, 14 minutes, and 8 seconds. You know, it's not just a lifetime, it's many lifetimes, and we can't have that in a post-Columbine environment.
In law enforcement training, when does an officer make a subjective decision to choose not to follow the incident commander?
Well, quite frankly, it's dangerous to self-deploy. You got to be careful about what you don't know and don't know. What if the chief really wasn't in office, as reported to many of the members in that hallway? I think many Uvalde PD officers reported, they heard and reported, hey, the chief's in charge, he's talking to the subject now. He's in an office with the subject. Those words have matters. So those officers are operating under false assumption. BORTAC commander arrives. It's been described as a BORTAC, as a SWAT situation. Hey, the SWAT team from San Antonio deployed and got there on the scene. We sent 2 SWAT teams because this report is a barricaded subject.
But there were also officers that were questioning, and it was picked up on the audio, whether or not the decisions that were being made were correct, and questioning whether or not there were kids actually in the classroom. Other officers weren't referring to an office other than just reporting what the chief was saying, and they were questioning that. At what point is a subjective decision made to veer away from the incident commander's decision?
And I'll let you, that's a great question for some of the subject matter experts that you'll have. But it's been my experience is that, well, first of all, most decisions have these types of consequences in this regard, but it's always dangerous. For example, I'll use it. I got a trooper 3 years out of the academy, shows up, okay, to a scene, hasn't been briefed, has been told information, and my expectation that he's going to act like he's in charge of the situation is going to have disastrous results because he may not be that smart and may not be as smart as the on-scene commander and doesn't have the information as the on-scene commander. And if it's an ISD, they know the school. They know the layout. So it'd be my expectation when we arrive, we arrive there and do everything we can to support the men and women, the on-scene commander on the ground, plain and simple. And that's our policy. It's our doctrine. And I think anything deviation of it, that there's a takeover by the state or takeover by the federal at some point in time, I think is dangerous.
Well, I appreciate your answers on that, and I think it's important for the committee and also for those listening to understand how those decisions are made or not made in a crisis situation where an incident commander is established and officers that are responding are following their lead.
There's no shame at all. When you're chief and you have a 6-man department to defer to the Uvalde Police Department that has as many as 60 officers, or the sheriff's office.
With the lack of interoperability of the radios that was mentioned, is there any conceivable scenario where the text messages in that 77 minutes of delay that were coming from the children inside the classroom to 911, is there any conceivable situation where those outside the school building would get that information from dispatch and simply courier or deliver that information into the school building where the officers were located so that different decisions could be made to shift from barricaded intruder protocol back to active shooter protocol? How is it possible that that didn't happen?
All we know is one officer did hear that. Well, first of all, I can tell you the radio traffic is chaotic. There's hundreds of officers talking all over each other is a term when you're stepping on each other in terms of talking on the radio. So it's going bits and pieces out. As we've already talked about, you're not picking it up inside. But there was an officer that did hear that and asked it to be repeated and did have that particular information. We don't know who he told that to, okay? And if that information was ever communicated to the on-scene commander. I mean, that's something that we want to follow up on, and but I'm not in a position to discuss that at this particular point in time.
So there's just, in a chaotic situation like that, there is no way to channel dispatch and information coming directly into dispatch straight to Command Central, where...
Well, not in this case, but it doesn't mean you can't be relayed. I mean, there's all those options. You know, the cell phones work, okay? You don't have to depend upon just one means that people are stepping over. There's other options. There's always other options.
Is there any protocol for breach of the exterior classroom window in a situation where an active shooter is in place in a classroom like we've discussed?
Certainly. And there's, in fact, one could argue it's safer to do so. We've got an exterior wall that's got brick and mortar versus a, sheetrock.
But is there any evidence to show that there were officers on the exterior of the building trying
They didn't
to
use that as an
locate the
option.
shooter or the students that were located in the classroom?
Well,
has that remained a mystery?
No, I mean, the officers rescued hundreds of children using those windows in different classrooms. And keep in mind, right across from 111 and 112, the children are in danger in any of those classrooms, so they had to be extracted not into the hallway, but through the windows by breaking the windows out and extracting the kids and teachers through the windows.
Just a few years ago after Santa Fe, the Senate led an effort to remove the cap on the school marshal programs across the state. There was a cap on the number of marshals that could be implemented by school districts, and that cap was removed at that time. There are 62 districts out of 1,022 that currently use a program like that, whether it's a guardian program or a school marshal program. From a law enforcement perspective, do you have any objection to establishing a program like that on school campuses, knowing that there's eligibility established, training established, and cooperation between that designated school marshal and the local emergency operations plan for an active shooter situation? Do you have any reservation for school districts implementing a program like that?
I mean, no, I've testified before that there's not enough police officers in the state to be everywhere at once. And we've got many, many campuses and many thousands and tens of thousands of children that need to be protected. So at the end of the day, seconds matter. And we saw in White Settlement, it wasn't a police officer, it was a civilian. Sutherland Springs, it was a civilian. He wasn't a marshal. He went home and got his rifle and took the subject out. So there's you can't ignore that as a particular option and the importance of the shooter getting confronted early and often.
Well, when Senator Birdwell and I were both advancing bills that both passed, they had nuances based on a locker and protocols for the safety of a locker being used. But both of those bills passed in that session, and the testimony against that legislation was mainly by organizations representing teachers, just saying that they didn't feel safe even under those protocols with that type of training and that type of collaboration with law enforcement that's responsible for those emergency operations plans in an active shooter situation. Much of the opposition in committee and in testimony were from the teacher organizations that just did not want to have those programs on their campus. But my information is out of the districts that have implemented expanded guardian or school marshal programs, we haven't had an active shooter situation on those campuses. That's the information that I have. Do you know any information different than that?
No, but I don't know that I can say that one's causal, but I can certainly say that, I've got 4 granddaughters, and I would expect or would hope that, that if somebody came on campus, like this shooter, that someone would be in a position to do something before law enforcement got there. As you saw, even when they arrived, I mean, and they arrived relatively quickly, but even when these officers arrived, it was 3 minutes. They went in the door 3 minutes after the subject went in the door. And how many rounds did he fire? 100 rounds in minutes. And, so they, ideally he'd have been confronted is in that south-north hallway. Is a perfect T intersection, before the subject can get to 111 and 112, before he can put his hands on door 111. That's what right looked like in that regard. Moreover, I mean, one of the challenges in the West Building, and the experts can talk about it, is that you got officers overstacked on one side, east-west hallway, and they're at the other side. If the subject wanted to, kill police officers, he just had to step out in the hallway, okay, because of the crossfire. And that goes back to, how at best, and of course the experts are in a better position to discuss this and make recommendations on that, and I'm sure that they'll be able to do so.
Director, I appreciate your testimony today and your willingness to continue to find the answers so that we can certainly make the decisions we need to make to keep these kids safe in our schools in Texas. And I just want to wrap up with this. Within 3 minutes of the shooter entering the building, 9 officers were in the school with pistols and rifles, and the classroom doors to classroom 111 and 112 were unlocked. Within 5 minutes of the shooter entering the building, Chief Arredondo is saying that he doesn't have the necessary resources to advance on the shooter. And then I guess I would ask you this last question again, and I know it's repetitive. How many minutes from the shooter entering the building did the officers eventually decide to advance and to neutralize the shooter? How many minutes went by?
1 hour, 14 minutes and 8 seconds.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator West, you're going to be next, but we've had the director, testifying for an hour and 50 minutes straight right now. And I think what we need to do is do a 5-minute break for everybody. And Senator, so I'm showing 11, let's call it 11:20. Thanks.
Good idea. Just get ready to have to take a break. We never do that. That's a good idea, though.
Director McCraw, you ready? Okay. Recognize Senator West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Director McCraw, you had made a statement during your testimony, at least this is what I heard, that when DPS was in control of the scene. Let's make certain we have clarity in terms of what you were referring to.
Yes, sir. Well, DPS didn't have control of the scene. I just mentioned that we did have a trooper, and the first trooper arrived at 11:42 with 2 other officers and observed numerous officers in the hallway and left after 2 minutes.
So in terms of what role, and let's make certain all of us want transparency as it relates to what's going on in this process, and that has been a problem, and I think that Senator Colcourse has mentioned that. As it relates to transparency concerning the investigation, where are we as it relates to that?
Yes, sir. Well, first, I know that the initial request, I think the local police department, specifically ISD, wanted to conduct the investigation. The district attorney asked the Texas Rangers to conduct the investigation, and we've had the lead on the investigation since the beginning. So this was on May 24th that we took leadership role in that investigation. As I mentioned, many different agencies assisted in this, and we continue to work with other agencies, and we have more to do. Much has been accomplished, but much more needs to be done. And importantly, we've got, well, I won't even go through the different areas we've got to cover, but those things need to be done before this investigation completed and turned over to the district attorney for her review. Okay.
Obviously, last evening there was a video that was released by, I think, the Austin American Statesman or Texas Tribune. It's been shown all over America. Is there other video that we should be reviewing as part of this investigation?
Well, you can remove all the videos, needs to be reviewed, and at some point, will need to be made public, and I have great confidence that the district attorney will do that when the investigation is completed. I have no doubt. Certainly, body cameras are relevant. Certainly, the footage internal from the inside the school, the surveillance video, and I'll also say the surveillance video from the enhanced version from the funeral home is all appropriate.
So there's additional video that has not been released.
Absolutely. And let me, if you don't mind, Senator, give me an opportunity. Is that one of the concerns that the district attorney has not wanted to keep information from the public. She just wanted to keep misinformation from the public. Okay, inaccurate information. She's never really, and that's the challenge she has, and for only one reason, because of the impact on victims.
Well, let's go down that road just a little bit.
Sure.
In terms of accurate information, is there accurate information that the district attorney currently has that could be released to the public so the public could get a better sense that transparency is in fact occurring?
Well, I'm sure there's no question that videos, when they're released, and certainly you as a member of the legislature would have access to it and a legislative privilege to look at it. The House Investigative Committee has access to it, and we provided them so they can review those themselves in detail. But we have asked, because we've been asked by the district attorney, to ensure that we don't, one, talk to the media, which we haven't done any press conferences since then. The only thing we've done is maybe refuted some of the statements and tried to correct those particular statements. And we've been very clear that we haven't released any information, videos or otherwise, to the media.
Okay, as it relates to the video that was released somehow, it shows at least one officer there with a rifle and another one with a shield. Is that correct?
Well, what we'll show is that within minutes after the subject entered.
I'm talking about the video.
Yeah, well, the video will show that there's as many as 11 officers and 2 rifles minutes after the law enforcement entering on the scene.
Okay.
Now, I think I said before 9, but it was really 11 because there's another 4 that came in. There was 3 initially, then 4. Okay, then another 4 came in, and then another 4 came in.
I understand that.
Yes,
I'm talking about the video that we saw. I only saw.
Yes,
I didn't see 11 officers on that video. Maybe I didn't see the correct one. I saw one with a shield and one on the right with the shield and one on the left with a right.
And frankly, I didn't watch it.
Okay.
I've watched the entire video. I've watched snippets or whatever may have been released, so I couldn't comment.
And I'm going to go back to a question that was asked to you by Senator Creighton as it relates to the officer with the shield. And I didn't understand your response to that. The question, I believe, was whether that officer with the shield could have advanced and tried to breach the door or at least try to save some of the kids in that room.
Well, it was my testimony, Senator, that you didn't need a shield.
No, I understand whether you needed one or not.
Yeah.
I'm asking the question, with that shield, could the officer have done that?
Yeah, absolutely. It could have been used immediately.
Okay.
And which is the point, is that when there never, one was, there was one, then later came two, then three and four, and eventually there was 4 shields available to be used. Okay. And for the record, I want to be clear about when that shield arrived, but the first one, didn't arrive until sometime after the officers went in. It was the second shield arrived at 12:03.
The first shield arrived when?
Yeah, the first shield arrived at 11:52. The second and third shield arrived thereafter.
And it's a fact that you heard that, well, I think that there were shots fired after the first shield arrived. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, and I'm not going to be repetitive. I do have some other questions as it relates to recommendations that should be made that you're recommending. Now, but before I do that, the Department of Public Safety has no role in school safety audits. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Is there, in terms of recommendations, I know that you were asked about school marshals and guardians. Is there any reservation from, let me back up, you are the chief law enforcement officer for the state of Texas. Is that correct?
Well, certainly the head of the Department of Public Safety. We can question in terms of who's the head of what, but I'm certainly head of the department.
You're the head of the Department of Public Safety.
Yes, sir.
Is there any reservations on the part of the department arming teachers in schools?
Not if they're trained. None whatsoever.
Okay. I want to turn not necessarily to schools, but an incident that happened in Duncanville, Texas last week. Mm-hmm. Let me just set it up for you. A recreation center where there was a summer youth program with over 100 kids in that program. And a person came in with a gun unrelated to any terrorist activity, but once in there, decided to fire the weapon, and he was taken out by a consortium of police departments there in the area.
Yes, sir.
Is there any concern by you, as the head of the Department of Public Safety, about similar types of settings where kids are in summer camp, as an example, or you have a large number of kids in their safety?
Absolutely. In fact, anytime that you have a large aggregation of children in any location, especially outdoors or in this location in terms of Duncanville that you described, which is what connected to a school, but certainly was affiliated with school outside activities, we're always concerned. It's a soft target to begin with. There's not the security usually in place, and certainly, people that are trying to do the most harm can do the most harm by killing our children.
Are there any best practices for protecting those kids?
Well, I know one thing is that Duncanville is an example of Texas law enforcement responding. They immediately isolated the subject, and certainly neutralized them, and he's no longer with us. And that's important that we have that type of response. And they were on scene almost minutes. They were right there. That's what, of course, the whole point of alert training has been designed, is that actions you don't wait on actions. Actions are immediately taken, and that's a good example of how things should be done.
Okay, and let me ask a couple more questions. And as it relates to the weapon that was used in Uvalde, you mentioned that, and I think in our private conversation, that there was 170 rounds fired?
171 rounds, the subject total fired. 3 at the beginning, and we had another 24, 27, 57, and 60. Is
a person, a reasonable person, you would not obviously consider this person a reasonable person based on what you're saying, that person had some mental illnesses, that red flags for mental illness. But a person in the same or similar circumstances at 19 years of age, are they mature enough to be able to handle, or should we have a situation where a person 19 years of age be able to get an assault weapon, an AR-15?
Yeah, well, that's of course a policy decision on what that is and is not. I can just say that certain people shouldn't have one, okay? And certainly this is one person that should not have had one.
Should the average 19-year-old be able to have one without any training?
Yeah, it's hard to me because I was in the Army at that time in my life. But too many people have served bravely and sacrificed for their country that are 18 years old. So it's difficult for me to say that nobody's mature enough at that age. All I can say is that certain people will never be mature enough, and certain people, are going to be a threat when they are able to have weapons.
Should they be? You had training to use those type of weapons in the Army, though.
I'm sorry?
You had training to be able to use those weapons.
Yes, sir, we did.
Right.
Yes, sir.
And also screenings, correct?
I'm sorry?
Psychological screening?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you believe that in order to make certain that those persons that are able to get those weapons have psychological screening and also training?
Yeah, that again goes back to policy. It's hard for me to say whether that would work or not. I just know that we don't. Certain people, and I'll use this specifically, and you've already addressed this, violent offenders, for example, ought not to have access to weapons, and plain and simple. So there are certain people, and I can tell you from a professional standpoint, if someone has got, if we've got some very specific and credible information, okay, specific and credible being the operative word, on individuals, and they're a threat in the community, that certainly, to the extent that they would have limited access to weapons, would be helpful.
Would you agree with me that if we increase the age to 21 years old, that most parents will feel confident, in addition to other things that we're doing, and as it relates to recommendations, that most parents would feel confident that their children's safety would in fact be safeguarded in the state of Texas? Yeah,
I'm really not in a position to comment on how they would interpret that, whether they feel safe or not, Senator. Frankly, I think that's way above my pay grade in terms of this particular issue.
I'm going to ask you one then. You have grandchildren, right?
I do.
Would their grandparents feel safer?
Well, the grandparents will feel safe if they're safe people with guns, not with unsafe people, if that's a quick cop-out. But at the end of the day, is that some people with guns are good people with guns at whatever age, okay, or as long as they're responsible, okay, is not necessarily a bad thing. And unfortunately, in a day like today, when there's not enough officers to be everywhere all at once, we may need someone at the White Settlement inside a church. We may need somebody outside another church in Sutherland Springs, or a teacher inside of a school. They may be the only thing standing away from a mass murderer and the lives of the children.
You would agree with me that when we begin to look at these mass shooters, that the age ranges between, I think, 16 to 21 or 16 to 19, somewhere from there. Is that correct?
I would have to go back and look at some of the data that the FBI and the Secret Service have on the history. I've seen it before. We have a report on that information, but I couldn't tell you the exact average age.
I think the average age is around 19.
Okay.
If that's the case, then do you think that we need to take a second look at whether or not those persons are mature enough in order to operate such high caliber weapons?
I think it's less to do about maturity and more to do with about mental capacity. I mean, there are certain people that are, they may be immature, but they're not evil.
Well, and I agree with you. I'm not saying that we take the weapons away from those persons, but have it just like we have age range for drinking and other cigarettes and everything else.
I understand.
Should we not look at saying that you need to be age certain in order to...
Well, you already restrict handguns, I believe. Yes, sir.
Let me finish.
Yes, sir.
All right. You should be an age certain before you are able to purchase a weapon of that magnitude?
Well, sir, I can see why you would want to, because at the end of the day, you've already restricted handguns, okay, from anyone until they're 21 years old. So, I mean, you've already, the state legislature's already done that. So that's certainly, like I said, goes back to a policy decision.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Birdwell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Director, for the rigor that you've put into not just here today, but the response over the last 4 weeks. Let me return to the lock for just a moment. I wanted to make sure that for the teacher to have locked the door, they would have had to lock it from the outside, thus abandoning the children to a locked room with them outside. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, sir.
Okay. As it relates to the breach, you've mentioned a hooligan, and I think one other type of breaching tool. Did any officer have shotgun slug capacity to breach on location?
Well, many officers had shotguns. I don't know that it's a recommended breach technique, frankly, especially with children in the room. I think it would be when you have other options. I don't think that would be but I'll defer to the experts in terms of that. We certainly will use.
I consider you an expert, Director.
Well, we use breaching ourselves, okay? We use sometimes explosive breachings, usually a hostage situation or a barricaded subject, but certainly not an active shooter.
Say that last piece. Even though I have my phone on silent, it went into my hearing aids, and so I was.
Oh, yes, sir.
My ringtone instead of your answer.
We'll certainly do breaches. We'll do it. Use a number of different methods. Okay, but the breaches that we're talking about, that might be explosive breaches, dual breaches, front and back. We would never do that in an active shooter situation.
Right.
Okay, say never is never, but those are designed for hostage situations.
Right. Well, you're talking C4 blasting caps, and the
yes,
like.
Sir. Yes, sir. And the same thing with the shotgun breach along those lines. So there's risk of projectiles and material going into the room and striking somebody at that point.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I just was thinking through the.
Yes, sir.
Action or weight, and it's clear from your testimony that the weighting was the challenge.
Absolutely.
That's why I was interested in the answer to that question. Let me, at the very end of your timeline, you mentioned that the breach occurs.
Yes, sir.
The media has reported, but just because you read it doesn't mean it's true, that the Border Patrol agents are who actually made the breach. Do you know whether or not Border or Uvalde PD made the breach?
Well, both. Border was a stack of 7. We had the majority Border Patrol, but we had 2 deputy sheriffs. I believe a PD officer on it as well in terms of the breach.
So with all of that representative rigor of it leads me to my next line of questioning, similar to Senator Creighton's, with all that representational rigor of various agencies.
Mm-hmm.
The Uvalde police chief is still the active commander of the scene.
Yes, it could be argued that he turned it over at some point from the tactical, because he did make the request for tactical capability. And when we say BORTAC, they've got an elite SWAT team, Border Patrol. Elements of the BORTAC because arrived, and so that's why you see the breakdown on the stack. And the stack is how many people get to go through the door. You don't get to put yourself in front of the stack. And the stack was 7 officers, and I think I mentioned 4 went in initially. Door closed, 3 followed shortly thereafter.
Okay. Okay. At 11:54. It says on your timeline that the DPS special agent enters the west building.
Yes, sir.
What's the difference between, for both our listeners and myself,
Sure.
I run into many troopers usually because I'm getting escorted from behind.
Yes, sir.
At 0 miles an hour on the side of the road.
Yes, sir.
But I've run into DPS sergeants and, lieutenants, captains. When I hear the term special agent, the first thing I think of is the similarity of an FBI special agent with a set of authority. What sets of authority does a DPS special agent have that's different from the trooper that entered?
None whatsoever, but what they do is they focus full-time on, let's say, gangs, organized crime investigations, for example, undercover investigations, surveillance techniques along those lines. insubordinate development and operations, criminal enterprise investigation, sex trafficking, for example. When you're going after the organization. So troopers patrol, okay, special agents focus on the organized criminal activity. Texas Rangers, have major violent crime cases and assist in those types of investigations, and certainly command and control of our tactical operations we put on the Ranger Division as well.
Okay. And I'm going to ask another question I think you've already answered, but in the timeline, it's clear that the DPS special agent is very focused on breaching now.
Yes, sir.
With his arrival. Is there, and I fully understand, not just from the law enforcement perspective, but of unity of command is one of the principles of war.
Mm-hmm.
So I fully understand your hesitance and standard policy to not arrive and commandeer the situation simply because your state police officer has arrived. Is there any protocol in your mind from seeing the lesson here or seeing the circumstances in its totality, where there'd be any change to that protocol where the assessment of sheriff or a DPS special agent or some senior law enforcement official from a senior law enforcement agency that has geographic jurisdiction as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any change in that protocol, that some situation that protocol should change, where you should have the authority to not wait for a request from the chief of police,
mm-hmm.
but subsume that organization and take command?
Well, first, we wanted to make sure we put that his body camera statements in this as a matter of transparency. And we had people in the building, too, a chance to go in. He managed to work his way in. He wasn't invited in, work his way in, and eventually, as described, and you heard the statements, but it gave kind of the mindset in terms of someone coming in, what information is being provided. And certainly through his body camera, you can see as many as 15 officers stacked up, so you get an impression. That's why the information is included in that regard.
Okay.
It's my belief, okay, because we got some tremendous leaders throughout the state, and law enforcement is such a vital profession. We got such great law enforcement professionals at all levels, including Uvalde Police Department and Uvalde ISD. I mean, they've got great officers that would willingly give their life. Okay, but we can't afford as bad decisions as you indicated in that regard, and I'm quite, hopeful that with training, because sometimes this is a leadership issue, is that, hey, some people don't need to be in those particular positions, that this will never happen again, and people will be mindful is that, wait a minute, it's not a barricaded subject. You can't declare containment and declare victory and wait for the cavalry to arrive and to strike that home. And that's, I think, critical. And that's something we have as our profession. Okay, we clearly failed in that because someone didn't get it, and we just need to make sure that's in place. Inviting let's say a DPS captain shows up and a situation decides, well, he's going to exercise control. Well, first of all, he doesn't have the information, and you know what? He may not be as sharp as the on-scene commander that's there. In addition, not having the information. So I'm reluctant to encourage, even think of any situation where you'd want some level of hierarchy where a larger police department gets to come in and take over, that type of thing. I mean, but at the same point, we need leaders in place that recognize their capabilities. And if you don't, there's nothing wrong, and I do it frequently, I delegate it way on down. That's one of the expertise. Expert's not where I'm at. The expertise is always at least 2 levels down, removed from me, and we expect,
Yeah, just like I don't want division commanders fighting platoons. I want them to fight the division.
Yes, sir.
The same
Yes,
logic and thought process. A different area of thought here is there, and I want to give you discretion to not answer this question if it's law enforcement sensitive. Is there any evidence that cartels, border gangs / belligerents provided any material support to the shooter, purchase of the weapons, finance of the weapons, because of the number of border agents that have kids in that school? Is there anything that you think that you've seen that relates to this being a hostile act supported by or belligerent
None
opponents of the board?
whatsoever.
None? Okay.
And it was initially reported that he was linked or was a part of the individual, the two individuals who were involved in the conspiracy to commit capital murder at the school back in 2018. No, he was not one of them, nor was he linked to them in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. Just
Yes, sir.
very sensitive to the nature of the work that both the Border Patrol and our own state agencies are doing down there, so.
We have no reason to believe that he has acted alone. The subject acted alone.
Okay.
He said some things that should have been reported, but he acted alone.
Okay. Different area, and I don't know if you've looked at this in the totality of the events, but did any state agency play a part in placing the shooter with his grandmother, or was that solely a family decision?
I'm sorry, what again now?
Did any state agency play a part in placing the shooter with his grandmother for custody, or was that solely a family decision?
All the information that I have, best available information at this moment, that was a family decision.
Okay.
He was estranged from his father, and effectively, when he moved in with his grandparents in February, was estranged from his mother.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Campbell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director McCraw. Did the grandmother call the police after she was shot, or did the grandmother ever call the police?
Someone did. She ran across the street, okay, after she was shot, and went to a neighbor's house, and a neighbor was able to contact. The grandmother was unable to speak at that time.
Okay. We know no one checked the doorknob, right? And especially, I think that's an assumption that could be made that the shooter got in without a key, right? Did the shooter try different doors? Why did the shooter choose that room?
Well, he went to the west door,
Right.
and of course, that's clearly it was his direction where he was going. He could have gone to the south door. He chose the west door, and we don't know what reasons for that. And he walked deliberately. Now, there were not kids. They were at that particular time. The kids were at lunch in some of the rooms on the left as he proceeded down the east-west hallway, and he turned right. And then he went into 11 and 112 was his focus. Didn't fire down the hallway. All his focus was focused on those two rooms.
Was he just in room 111, or did he go into both rooms?
He went to both rooms.
Are they separated?
They're separated, but there's a connecting door.
So he went into inside.
And it's often left unlocked, the connecting door, and there's no bolts that you can bolt it from either side to prevent entry. So it would be easy for him, and he did, access 112 from 111, and vice versa.
Okay, goodness. Are classrooms fitted with an alarm, an individual? Like in the emergency room, we have a button we can push if there's a situation where we need to call.
No, there's no, and that's one of the things we found in the vulnerability assessment. There was no, we'll call it a panic type of button that can alert the entire campus at the same time.
Right. So we don't have that in the school.
That's correct. Well, at least at this school, did not.
Is there, do you know, is there a central place that if somebody, like the principal's office or administrative office, where if they're notified, they can push a button and it ring an alarm or make an announcement?
They use what they call the Raptor system, okay, to send out information. And be very careful about alarms. As we ran in Santa Fe, a fire alarm, kids get them out of the classroom, right? They're getting out of the building. Mm-hmm. They could put them and teachers in harm's way moving towards the shooter, which is the case, which happens. So they use a system that did notify, but it was one of the recommendations, as I mentioned earlier, that we had is a centralized alert system that would notify everybody at the same time.
So do they use a code system? In hospitals, we use code system. Code blue, code black, code orange.
No, ma'am. There's no.
They could just say overhead, so the teachers would know that it was an active shooter situation, but the children don't know to run out in the hall.
No, but although they didn't have a address system throughout the campus that was linked to a mass alert system, they didn't have it. Of course, I did indicate earlier the teachers took it upon themselves and the administrators to exercise their protocols, and they were really, even before the shooter got in school, they went ahead and implemented their active shooter protocol. And certainly they did in the West building, and Unfortunately, in the west building, as I described earlier, the west and south doors open, but even if the south door was locked or west door was locked, he could have still entered in literally seconds just by breaching that door, in terms of breaching that door, so it wouldn't have been much.
Okay. How, and you may not know, or why did the chief say, we've lost 2 kids? Where did he get that number? What made him think?
I don't know. We were unable to re-interview him.
Okay. It is deeply concerning, I'll say, to hear a statement that if he starts shooting again, we're going to lose more kids, which is probably a true statement, obviously. But then for him to say, but we have to put those to the side right now. Was he?
Well, that's alarming, but obviously, and it was picked up by a body camera. And that said, one of the reasons we wanted to re-interview the chief is simply because allow him to put that in context, why he said that, what he meant at that particular point.
It's just really important for in any trauma situation, any kind of an emergency such as this, it's most important to get the victim, somebody shot, somebody injured, as quickly as possible to an emergency room. Because that first hour is called the golden hour, yes, for which mortality, morbidity goes down if they can get to the hospital. And it seems like it was not, I'm not sure that was of concern, or the delay most certainly missed the opportunities to save any children that possibly could have been saved. And I think it was always an active shooter situation, but not always treated as an active shooter situation.
I think that's well said. It never changed. It was always an active situation. The situation was always dire. The timeline was always critical. And, every second mattered.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your time and being here, and I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can and go through a few things. First of all, looking at the bar lock, it was the same door I had in my high school when I graduated 43 years ago.
Yes, sir.
Hadn't changed. But if my thoughts are correct, there's a little bitty hole to the very far end of that, and it's a hex key.
Yes, sir.
And that you literally can turn that to where it will not lock as it's closed, or you can turn it and it will lock automatically.
Yes, sir.
So someone consciously had made a decision that it was okay to have that as a non-locking door that day, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do we know who that person is?
No, sir, we don't know that.
Do we know if it was standard operating procedure for the school district to basically allow that to happen and nobody oversight?
I don't think the school district, but we have had reports. Again, these are interviews that those doors were often, the south and west doors were often left open.
So my point here is there's a conscious decision somewhere along the food chain, people responsible, and we don't know who they are. I feel sorry for what they're living through today that made a conscious decision to hex key that. And that is if I went through my districts of 150 almost school districts, I can almost guarantee you that is the door that's in these schoolhouses. Secondly, and I know you're not Texas School District Safety Administrator plan, but are you familiar with any of and we left a lot of discretion to the districts, and I think we're maybe seeing that wasn't the best choice, but I can talk from my district, and I won't name district specifics because sometimes you don't want to share the secret sauce, but you said at 11:21 grandmother was shot, 911 was called.
Yes, sir.
If 0.29 miles, if that event occurred in my districts, at least my ones that I'm familiar with, 911 would have been basically on a school lockdown mission at that point, that people have positions to say there's been a domestic violence, there's been an issue, there's a disturbance in the neighborhoods close enough to the district's campuses, it would have been shut down. Do you know, and if it's not your bailiwick, tell me that's TEA, but do you know if there was a safety plan in place that would have said lockdown in the event of X being close proximity to the school?
No, sir, I don't know that.
Is that something you're familiar with?
I am familiar with that, and I'm also familiar with that quite frequently some of the newer schools are far better. And in fact, they have some of these gaps that exist on this Robb Elementary don't exist at some other campuses that I've seen.
Is it fair to say that that should be something that if there's a domestic or some other incident close enough to a school, that school should have immediate lockdown?
Absolutely.
Second,
I'm trying to look at the exact time the 911 call came in.
it was in your previous
Yes,
testimony,
so
1121.
yeah.
And it doesn't matter.
Yes,
I mean,
sir.
that's off campus. But in my area of the woods, if that would have happened, schools would have been immediately locked down.
Yes, sir.
Automatic. Second time, the individual crashes into a ditch adjacent to the school property.
Yes, sir.
And the school to this date, was there any indication that there was a lockdown? That hey, we got problems and we need to lock this down? We had a teacher calling from the inside saying we got issues.
Yep.
Who's responsible, if you know? Was it to make sure the campus was locked down?
I'm not sure who was responsible for doing it. I know that teacher, her actions resulted in the campus being locked down.
But really not. We left the door open.
Yeah, exactly.
But somebody on the campus did take the initiative at the point of at least the wreck on the ditch of locking down the campus.
Yes, sir.
It just didn't get done.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Well, the two doors were open, exactly.
So I guess my whole point of this conversation is was evidence that there was actual protocol to lock the school down. It just wasn't successful.
I think there was protocol, and we saw it in the Raptor system that went out, and the fact that the teachers got the word and were protecting their children in their classrooms, doing what they were supposed to do. So I would say that they did go into lockdown, and as they should have. Now, we did recommend some efficiencies that can be changed in terms of a mass alert system around campus. There's things to improve,
Sure, I'm all about the panic button. Okay, so we'll move forward. 3 different occasions under current existing protocols. And do you know if Uvalde had a safety plan?
The high school or the school, Robb Elementary.
Do they have a safety plan? Do you know?
I'm not aware. That's one of the things we asked School Safety Center to take a look at.
I get it. So to that lock, it's created by design to where an individual can keep it from locking. That's a conscious decision.
Yes, sir.
I'm not a safety expert, but there's a lot of Captain Obvious moments in these events, and I'm not here to put blame on any one person, but the truth of the matter is we're seeking answers that may be relevant. But to Senator Birdwell pointed it out finally in the group, but why would you have a door that doesn't secure from the inside, knowing that if there's a fire, something that the inside can open? It's like a bathroom door. Mm-hmm. Why would you have a door in place that required outside interaction to secure it from the outside in? I mean, what is the logic behind having a door like that to start with? Where is that miscommunicated? Would that, it's ingress and egress and safety protocol, right? Keeping people out.
Yes, sir.
Is that number one rule of safety?
Absolutely.
What would be the reason that door lock would be something that's universally around our school buildings?
I can't explain it. It makes no sense at all. In fact, I know there's things that have been designed can be used in light of or in spite of locking system like this, but it makes no sense.
There's no reason you can believe that that would make sense from a safety protocol.
Yeah, I can't imagine that this is safe. And another thing, Senator, is that there's no way for the teacher to know whether it's locked or not.
Well, I agree with that.
That's another problem.
That goes back to technology exists today with the panic button. It's immediately magnetically controlled. I mean, there's a lot of options. down to a $5 doorstop on some level in
Yes.
some places.
Yes, sir.
Because you're just looking for resistance. Because
Exactly.
that person's looking for the easiest access, correct?
Yes, sir.
They're not spending time wondering whether the door, and they're moving, right? They're on a mission.
Yes, sir.
I'm glad you said that because I couldn't, in my mind, believe, and honestly, that's probably universal in our school buildings too. We're locking we're locking the good guys into the area where the bad guys are. I don't understand how that would examine. So, Campbell identification. You said it kind of indirectly, and again, since you're not the safety school managers, it's more TA, but. From a first responder, if I have multiple campuses on site, would it not be beneficial to have campus A, B, and then corresponding room numbers inside, along with that map that you said was inaccurate on the get-go, that y'all are trained on in that area?
Yeah, certainly standardization would be beneficial, and knowledge of the campus.
All right. I talked to my superintendents, several of them, and universally, their response to school safety was, in some respects, pretty thorough, but still left a lot to be desired on classroom lockdown. And some of them went to vestibules and beep-ins and stuff. But let me ask you the question this way. If you're limited on resources, and most school districts will say they are, that's debatable, but most will say they are, when it comes to prioritization of safety. If you're looking at personnel versus hardening of the assets, keeping people out, acknowledging that there is a limitation to people, both in physical, logistically being there, and number two, we've seen where people are have human failures in making the right decision when stressed. Giving a budget from a local school district, if you had to pick a path, would you pick hardening and egress access issues over a resource officer that scope is very limited on what they get done?
Well, even though I'm in the law enforcement profession, I lean that way. If we have a resource officer on scene that knows the building, knows the schools, knows the layout, knows the students, knows the teachers, and he's there, just like in Santa Fe, immediately on site when that happened. And that's, and allows the law enforcement to do exactly what we've been charged to do, and that's to isolate and neutralize this.
That's reactive.
That's right.
That's reactive.
Yes, sir.
Big difference in reactive and keeping the individual out of the classroom to begin with.
Yes, sir.
So if I'm looking at the numbers as a dollar goes, and I say I can spend $80,000 for a resource officer, or I could put $80,000 into locking down, replacing locks, taking the human element out of it, are you still going to go with the personnel choice?
I hate to say this, I'd go with 160,000. I'd have both.
Well, no, I don't disagree.
Yeah, because
But that's not the world I'm told.
Hey, the longer we can wait, because you do have local law enforcement 911 calls respond, the longer you can keep them out of the building, the more likely they have a chance to engage him before he can hurt somebody. So I don't disagree with having the proper doors and infrastructure in place and really even the perimeter, okay, to make it difficult to get them into when kids are in school.
I agree. I think that most of the 1,200 districts need to do a rethink, because it goes back to my opening comments. We got resource officers. They're not on every campus, and some of them are one for 8 campus buildings. And I spent a lot of money to get that, all well-intended and well-deserved, those individuals involved in that role. But if I could have kept that classroom locked from the inside, we wouldn't have 21 people in that classroom today.
Hey, 3 minutes would have made a difference. We could kept them out for 3 minutes. Those officers would have been in the hallway, and he could have never got to 111, 112. He'd have been dead.
But there was a decision made to leave that bar X-nut and to have doors that couldn't protect from the inside. Moving on to a different conversation, but in the same genre of things we're told to do on this committee. A lot of conversation, and again, everybody wants solutions, and everybody's looking for blame, and what can we do to prevent this? So, under a background check, this is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, I have no ownership or pride of ownership in this conversation. I am told, and you said this individual does not have a record that you can tell, but assuming that individual had a juvie record, that even if it's a juvenile record, that information is given over to you guys, which y'all forward every bit of that up to FBI, that then can make a decision whether to include that into the National Crime Database, which is the backbone of a federal background check when it comes to gun ownership. Is that true or not?
I believe that's true, that we can, and it would go into the NICS system, and it would be something we require before someone can purchase a gun.
So, to be clear, you know about this juvie record. You are required, and you do, I think, diligently send that to the federal authorities. And it is the federal authorities that decide whether or not that information is inclusive in a federal background database.
That's my understanding, yes, sir.
So, I want to remind members, this is the second, and if you really want to call it three. So the Midland shooter bought a gun and was not given a background check. Now that guy that was a FPL, federal license dealer, didn't do it, and he's in jail today. I'm not sure, but I think it was the Sutherland shooter that had a military background check that would have not, had it been done, had it been sent to the database, it would have been there for all eyes to see on a local background check.
Domestic violence.
And so that's two. And third, this not specific to this, but if a juvenile has a record, even though it's, quote, sealed, it is still accessible if the feds do their job and put it into the National Background Data Check.
Yes, sir.
So not only did we fail to lock a campus down, on 3 different occasions, at least from my districts, what their protocols say, not only our response was horrendous, that some of the solutions out there are reflective of a lack of understanding, but more importantly, the check the box. Because these people that get these juvie records from DPS in Texas to these federal levels, there's somebody looking at that going, it doesn't warrant. There's some system that allows them to choose to include it or not, and it doesn't get included. So we're just pushing paper around and telling everybody everything's good. But we have laws and systems in place today. So, social media, and it kind of goes to something that probably definitely is not in your bailiwick, but those messages that were in group context, you know who they are, I guess. By subpoena, you will. Are y'all having interactions with those people?
Yes, sir.
And there's really no recourse other than the guilt. But on the ones that were sympathetic, empathetic, or supportive, is there any recourse legally?
No, sir.
None at all. And without getting into the weeds, are those individuals like, so what, or we're sorry, or we should have said something, or is it remorseful, or is it more along the lines, you can't touch me?
A combination of many of those, but anywhere from it already blocked him and to someone that thought something was wrong, just didn't report it, to some that, as I indicated before, by their own text messages were empathetic or sympathetic.
So, and this is a hard question if you choose not to answer it, but it's just a system. What is the recourse ultimately to officers that are found to be neglectful in their response? I mean, what is TCO's response as far as removing officers so that they don't show up at some other campus 3 months out?
I'm not aware of anything at this particular point in time that puts them in a position to be able to do that. And individual agencies certainly have the authority to be able to hold the officers accountable for their actions.
So today, in state statute, obviously we've heard about the commander-in-chief and the lack of response. There's nothing in the system that would not prohibit him from showing up in XISD 6 months out, a year out, and becoming an officer.
Not that I'm aware of, unless he's terminated for cause, and there's something in his that would change his FI rating, so law enforcement officers would know whether it's a general discharge, an honorable discharge, or dishonorable discharge. That could certainly affect employment. And I believe T-Cole, well, I'm sure, can answer the questions as it relates to in terms of some of the tools that they have right now or don't have.
So you mentioned a couple of times notoriety. Let me ask it this way from the social media, and it plays into human nature, men specifically, about wanting to leave their mark, wanting to be significant, wanting to have purpose, wanting to be something, and that can be good or bad, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you think the social media aspect or the platform, and it's just been up in the last 30 years, right? Because we had these individuals. We knew who they were when we were going to high school and schools. These are all existed. I'm 60. We had these individuals that weren't treated right or felt like they were mistreated and had issues, but they didn't have a platform. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the idea that this guy knew that the minute he pulled that trigger, that he just got notoriety on a worldwide basis that will live, unfortunately, into perpetuity?
Absolutely.
You think that plays into the psyche?
Yeah, well, some of the statements he made would suggest exactly that.
All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your efforts.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, Senator Betancourt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With your permission, I'd like the Director McGraw to demonstrate the usage of the lock mechanism. If you could, Director.
Yes, sir. Hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll move away from it, so it may not carry all the way down here, but as you'll see, this is a door. It's not just a facsimile, it's in fact one of the doors we took out of the West Building. An interior door, as described before. This is the key. And right now, you may not be able to see it from that side, but right now you can tell that it's unlocked because when you move this, the throw goes back into it. When you twist it around, one loop, you can still move it. It seems like it's the same thing. You're opening it, but you can't because it didn't move the throw. It stays. It remains in that location. And as you can see, there's no way to lock this device. You can, even though it's inside, you can open it and go out, okay, even though it's locked, but you can't go back in because this is disengaged. And one thing I didn't mention, and you'll find it in probably many schools, is there's a device that what teachers will do a magnetic device, they just place on the side of it here. That way students can go to the restroom and come back in. Yeah. Now, obviously, that was not engaged. I mean, they had taken that out and of course, thought they had locked the door. But as I testified before, this door was, it was open. Okay, it was unsecured. Whether it was locked or not, it was unsecured because the throw did not fit correctly into the strike plate.
And Director, can that door be locked from the inside?
It cannot be locked from the inside. It cannot be.
All right. So I submit to you that you believe this door is commonplace at Robb Elementary?
This is ridiculous, and it's unexcusable. If you're looking at it from a security standpoint, there's many things. You said a doorstop will work. Okay. There's other techniques that are developed and you'll see promulgated around, whether YouTube videos or they made it around the country. But there's other things that can be done. They even teach in the CRAZE curriculum. That's a part of ALERT.
So, Director, when the school went into lockdown and the training that occurred, in reality, it's a myth. There is no school lockdown at Robb Elementary because the doors can't be locked from the inside. The external doors are open There is no barrier to a shooter walking into a classroom in this particular case because of the strike plate being broken. So we're training people in a situation where they simply don't have the equipment to protect themselves.
I would absolutely agree in this case. It starts with the exterior door. You didn't have, it was unlocked, but you did need to be unlocked for him to access. Even here, whether it's room 11 or 112, even with this webbing here, you can see it, but you can shoot it out. You can, and all you have to do is put your hand in there and open the door. So
and you certainly could shoot out that on, on multiple locations. So what we have is a situation that is, the school gets an alert and goes into lockdown, but there really is no lockdown at all.
Effectively, no.
Now, that's a pretty stunning.
Or no, I may better correct that. It's not an effective lockdown.
No, certainly not an effective lockdown. And unfortunately, people were trained on that one. I just want to ask some things about to confirm this. Channel 2 KPRC Houston said that the last active shooter training was in March. They have documentation to that. Can you confirm that?
I do. Can't say March, but I do know that they had active shooter training.
Right. So we've already seen. There's a ABC interview of the teacher, Mr. Reyes, who's miraculously survived. He said that he had already reported the strike plate problem.
Yes, sir.
So obviously, at least the school principal or someone in charge of the facility knew that this door was completely disabled from any ability to lock.
We can confirm he had reported it. Yes, sir.
Right. In addition, so all the reports that have been out, whether it's the San Antonio Express News, I can go on for a list, New York Post, et cetera, we now have confirmed that these doors, and the door in particular in classroom 111, could have not have possibly been locked. So that the shooter egressed and he did it more than once. He walked in the hall. That's what I understand.
Yes, sir.
So, clearly, this door was of zero obstacle to the shooter, and so now we have a culture where we think we've trained an entire school for lockdown, and because the external doors are wired open with the hex nut, as Senator Perry said, and because these doors cannot be locked from the inside, we set up a condition of failure in an active shooter environment.
I would say so, yes, sir. I want to be clear. The door was either locked or unlocked, but it was unsecured.
Right.
So I'd want to use that term to be very careful and precise on that, because either way, when we got there, it was unlocked, but either way, it was unsecured.
Right, because the only way to secure everything would have been do an individual inspection of every door, and you've already said that you took an outside key to lock the exterior doors.
Yes, sir.
And that would have been the same thing that would happen on the internal doors, would they not?
Yes, sir.
And then the last piece of this, which is there is simply, between classrooms 111 and 112, no effective lock mechanisms there at all, right?
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, members, what's really stunning is I don't know how many other schools out of the 8,000 campuses in Texas train with an active shooter type of program, but they don't have the equipment to do what we want them to do, which is protect the children of Texas. Obviously, there's no external barriers at Robb Elementary. The fence was 4 feet tall and breached in many places. There were ropes instead of, again, because it goes to your point of trying to slow the shooter down to be engaged on the exterior.
Yes, sir.
As opposed to the interior.
Yes, sir.
But if they're not slowed down, and if the external door can be opened with a touch of a hand, and the internal doors are not locked, there's no stopping a shooter from walking in a classroom who obviously had personal experience with classrooms 111 and 112.
Yes, sir.
Now, speaking of that, let's go over some things about the shooter. Obviously you've conducted many interviews in Uvalde. Can I ask how many roughly?
We've been at over 500 interviews. It's probably up to about 700 right now.
About 700 interviews. This is a town of 17,000 people.
Yes, sir.
So that's a pretty big sample.
Yes, sir.
Now, when you did these interviews, was he employed? There was one rumor he was at one point.
He was previously employed. He was not employed at the time. He was at this time of the shooting. He was not employed. He worked in the fast food industry.
And he worked in the fast food industry for how long?
Well, that's all he ever worked at. And he off and on, and he certainly worked in the first quarter of the earning period.
So we have a student maybe at best a student that's truant, that's working at the fast food restaurant. And out of all these interviews you had, how many times did they tell you that he was the one they were worried about?
Well, several times. We had only one teacher said that she always was worried about him. The one student that scared her most. So when he discussed, that last year he started, again, I mentioned earlier, started dressing as like a school shooter, started acting like a school shooter.
So maybe half a dozen times out of
yes, sir. Yeah.
That clearly identified this one person, Ramos, as the person they were extremely worried about.
Yes, sir. After the fact. They never reported that to law enforcement.
That was going to be my next
yes,
question.
Sir.
So at no time did they report this. Now, at any time, did anyone report the shooter Ramos literally carrying a sack of dead cats?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
And who did?
They didn't report to the officials. That was observed and reported when we did interviews.
So again, they've seen apparent, quite frankly, aberrant behavior, and they're worried. And in a town of 17,000, we've got at least a half a dozen people that were worried to the point where they thought he was going to be an active shooter. We've got animal cruelty that's been identified, but yet somehow through all of the reporting of people's thoughts, there's no official record in HPD, ISD that we know of.
None that we can find.
Well, that's a major failure. When you look at the police response, and I think because Senator Campbell said this, that golden hour goes by and people die. And in this case, I think it was Senator Creighton that had 11, well, actually, there was 9 people within a few minutes and then 11 total within just about 7. So there's 11 officers in the building, and this is by the timeline you've got at 11:36.
Yes, sir.
That is 8 minutes after he crashed his car. So we had 11 officers in the building, and I don't know, I'm going to just tell you this, reading your timeline, I don't know if it makes you angry. I alternated from sad to disappointed to flat out angry when I read this timeline, because it is an absolute total breakdown of any command and control. This is a textbook example of it. I've never seen, it's almost like, a mirage appeared, because the group started talking about offices instead of classrooms, about no one except for the DPS officer talking about where are the kids. It's almost incredible to see this type of response. Now, I'm going to submit to you, I don't believe there's any training in the world that could have helped this incident, Commander, because this last 25 minutes from 12:21 to 12:46 is a disgraceful diatribe of somebody that cannot possibly have responded to this crisis. The reasoning, there is no reasoning. The torrent of illogical statements here, and it is preposterous. And all along, people are dying. And what makes this more incredible to me is that there are at least 6 shots fired during this time. And I submit to you and members of the committee, every shot is a death. Why is this person shooting? He's killing somebody. But yet, this incident commander finds every reason to do nothing. And that's the tragedy of this document. Because clearly people were killed in the initial barrage. You said up to 100 rounds. But at least 6 rounds were shot afterwards. Probably the individual targets, at least 3, you'd have to, because of the groupings. And that means 3 children probably died. A teacher bled out. An hour plus goes on. So is there any T-close or any way that officers coming into a situation like that with a clearly dysfunctional and total breakdown of command and control, that somehow that can be rectified at a shooting like this? Or are we just looking at a shooting that tragically and horrifically lasted so long that it's so abnormal, so out of what the possible realm of responses are, that they simply no way to replace an incident commander that has literally melted into protoplasm?
Yeah. Well, the only thing that will make you more mad is to see the video. It'll be worse, I can assure you, if you see it. It's, as we mentioned before, it's antithetical. Everything that we practiced, preached, I mean, it's in contrary, and it is, unfortunately, what we're left with. And of course, we're trying to figure out solutions to this. And what solution? What can you? How do you overcome?
Director, that's my question.
Yeah.
There is no training that could have overcome this person's inability to command.
Yes, sir.
Person should have never even been in the job.
Absolutely.
Because there is no fact or supposition of fact that this response and the responses that are here are even remotely operationally correct. And there's so many opportunities that are lost. It's almost like a psychosis set in. And I challenged this individual. I had challenged this chief to come testify in public as to what happened here. Don't go hide in the house and talk privately. Come to the Senate, where the public of Texas can ask these questions. It's just abominable when you have to read this. I can only imagine what it was like for law enforcement professionals to see the video. And we have to understand that we're dealing with people whose lives were lost and people that died that clearly shouldn't have, in my opinion. And more importantly, we have to design systems that don't have our teachers and our students, their families, all believing that we're doing lockdown drills and it's a good thing, that they're ready for this. We have to have incident commanders that are ready for this. And if they're not, they should have never had the job. This man should have removed himself from the situation immediately, because just by looking at his response, he's incapable of it. And the fact that we're having this discussion without him, Mr. Chairman, members, I think is a sad testament to that. But the bottom line is, we're going to get to the bottom of these facts. You're demonstrating what happened at the door clearly shows that there was no door that was going to prevent, there's no access to that room that was being denied. And I just want to express the outrage of reading this for the first time. Because at the end of the day, we could have done better, but we will do better. And every recommendation this committee makes is based upon getting the facts. Because until now, we didn't have the facts. Till now, we were told a whole variety of things. But now, we're going to have to take known facts to make good known law. Because I submit, there are no badder facts than these that are on this table. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel McCraw, thank you for being here from the very beginning of this, not just for us, but to the state and the country and even the world watching. You have been a source of reliable information and of a steady hand, and we're glad you're here. we're glad we can get some answers from you, and we're thankful for you. Your training at the state and federal levels means something, and we're glad you're in this role. I want to ask you a couple of questions. Try not to cover too much ground that you've already dealt with. The grandmother, earlier that morning, after she was shot, I believe you said she made it to a neighbor's house. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, I've heard different things, as you know, so many sources and so much conflicting information. When the grandmother made it to the neighbor's house, there was a phone call for help. Was it a 911 call, or was it a call to a specific law enforcement agency, if you know?
A 911 call was made. At some point after that happened, a 911 call was made.
At some point after the grandmother was shot?
Yes.
So she made it to a neighbor's house, and they did call 911?
Yes, and then she was later transported, airlifted to San Antonio.
So if there were reports that the neighbor may have called a particular agency and that's not accurate, there was a 911 call as far as we know?
Yes. In fact, I think it's in the timeline. You'll see when the 911 call comes in.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to ask you also, you mentioned how the local officers, and in particular the school district officers on the scene, they know the layout, they know the buildings. Let's talk about that. Do we have a system in place where when officers arrive, they are given a floor plan, a blueprint? Tell us about that. This sounds like something we should be doing on a systemic level. How did that work here? How does that work? An officer arrives, and how do I know what's a classroom, what's an office? How does that work, and how did that work here?
Well, it just depends on the agency. Here they had an independent school district, you would assume, but they had many more campuses. They had 6 officers, chief, and many campuses, and I think at least 10 different campuses that they would cover. So the familiarity would be based upon, officers visiting the school, understanding the layout, having the plans in place, and of course, as I understand it, there was some practicing, and active shooter practicing done as well in training of those particular officers. I can say, and there'll be, I think chiefs of police will follow in that regard, what we found very effective is we practice together. And we train together, when we communicate together, and to the extent that we can do active shooter training with our local partners is always better. One of the things we were directed by the governor, and certainly supported and funded by the legislature since Santa Fe, troopers are required to stop by and visit the campuses. Get an idea get the layout, talk to teachers along those lines, understand. If you're going to do paperwork, you might as well do it in the parking lot to provide a visible presence. It doesn't cost anybody any money to be able to do that. In some cases, schools have offered offices, and we've taken advantage of that and have troopers in offices on campus, so we have somebody there at some point in time. One of the things we started doing after Santa Fe is try to get the blueprints, for schools. Because what we do is that in that way, when we have a tracker system, a text map tracker system in each patrol car, troopers can immediately push the school, and it takes them down, and we can see the blueprints. So when they're responding and they hear what building, they could also take a look in terms of the layout as they're going in. So just more information in that regard.
So the capability you just described, which we began to seek after Santa Fe, where the officer on the scene using his own technology can look at the layout. Are we getting there? Are we making progress there?
Well, we're certainly working to it. All jurisdictions are different in terms of where they're at and what they have and what capabilities they have. So I can attest to exactly what was in place, there in terms of the ISD response. We've been just investigating what actually had happened.
So as we read the timeline and we see these references to the shooter being in an office, contained in an office, it's just crushing for us to read that today, knowing what was happening. But as a rule, we rely on the officers who serve there, who work there, to know the layouts of the buildings and to know what's what. That's what we have to rely on today?
Yes, but even the first arriving officers will always have better information, than the last arriving officers, and that's a recognition, and it's something that's practiced and expected when you go through these exercises.
You mentioned in the timeline at 11:37 where there's a gunfire from the suspect that's injuring officers who were approaching the classroom doors. And you shared with us the video. It was not the highest quality, but you were able to get it enhanced and get an idea of what happened. You talked about these sheetrock walls.
Yes, sir.
I want to make sure I'm clear. So the officers who are approaching the doors and who get shot or shot at, is that gunfire coming through the walls, through the door? Do we know about that?
We can't say for sure. We're doing the trajectory right now, but it looks like both. And two officers that were Uvalde PD officers that bravely approached that door, and two of them were hit. Out of the three approached, two were hit out of the three that approached.
Right. Senator Betancourt and some other members asked you about training, and I think Senator Betancourt's question was focused on training of the teachers and the school personnel. You talked about our goal at DPS of training with the local officers. There have been reports about active shooter training that was done here. I believe I read where the Uvalde ISD chief talked about their training. Do we know what the officers at Uvalde ISD, were they receiving this alert training that we understand everyone gets, or do we know what kind of training they were getting, what kind of training they were performing?
T-Call can speak to the specific training of those officers, number one, and of course, alert will know whether they went through their version. Now, there's two different versions. There's a T-Call version, then there's a more intense version that the alert program puts on. And I think they'll document and certify who's attended their particular program and curriculum.
I want to ask you about what was going on outside the building while the events in the timeline were just taking place. And we've read media reports, we've heard from folks about people arriving, parents arriving. There was a reference to crowd control, I think. Give us an idea of what was happening outside as these minutes ticked by and parents and community members began to arrive on the scene.
Well, parents were continually updated through an email system to the school and told to go somewhere, but not the campus, to stay away from the campus. But parents being parents, as time goes by, where are you going to go? I mean, you want to know if it's your child. You would expect that. They're emotional.
That's right.
They're desperate.
That's right.
So
what happened?
Well, some parents, I can speak from the department in terms of we had to restrain at least two parents. One was trying to break through, and another one was trying to break through to students in a bus along those lines. Of course, you can't tell if they're parents or who they are at that point, and they were restrained, and understandably so. And I'm not saying that it's a bad call at all to have a perimeter and keep people out. I mean, especially if it's a barricaded situation. And you don't know. So it's understandable why the call was to keep parents out. It's also understandable why parents wanted to go in. And I'm not aware of any parents being arrested. Certainly we didn't arrest parents. Even one parent we put handcuffs on, we took him off. And I don't even have his name. We just, calmed down, everything was fine and went on. But it was certainly understandable why he wanted to break through the perimeter and run into the area.
Sir. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you some questions about Classroom 111 and Classroom 112. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the rest of the building. You've commented on this a little bit, and we, again, heard reports in the media about officers from different agencies going in to evacuate, maybe get their children, other children. Give us an idea of what was happening in the rest of the West Building as far as clearing, evacuating, and getting those students to safety.
Well, as I indicated, buildings 132, rooms 132 and 131, that core third grade, they were at lunch, so they weren't they weren't there at the time. They were gone at that time. So as you can see, 116, 106, 105, 101, these rooms had to be evacuated and were evacuated by officers to the backside. They took out the windows and evacuate them safely and orderly through that particular location. So that's one of the very good things that would have happened. Like I said before, you can only have so many officers in the hallway. And you can take a look at the chart, and you see that east and west hallway is where it was easily officers amassed. What you didn't see in the video is sometimes there's the impression that there's a lot of people right around 111 and 112. And that didn't happen. They were far away from 111 and 112 until the final breach, except for the three officers that went in quickly. Okay, the shots are fired. Then from there on out, We're basically moving into the east and west hallway and down to the south side of the entrance and declaring it a containment.
So that was going on during the events on the timeline, which we rightly focus on classrooms 111 and 112.
And what you'll see is in the video, we got many officers, different agencies. They show up, they stick their head in, they spend a couple minutes, and they leave because they understand that there's enough officers on the scene that are taking care of business.
Colonel, thank you. I want to ask you one more question about the building and the classrooms broadly. And you've talked so much about the doors today. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for trying to explain this to us. Many times, folks back home who are watching productions like this, they're frustrated because we're not asking the right questions. So I just want to make sure this is clear. Let's speak for a moment about all the classroom doors in the West Building, right? So not 111 and 12, but all the classroom doors in the West Building, you've told us, have this doorknob, this locking mechanism. Is that right?
That's correct.
And is it your impression that the doors, the classroom doors, were kept locked all the time? Is the default position locked?
It's supposed to be the default position is locked. That's why I mentioned the magnets are loose sometime when students are going back and forth.
So ideally, we're not talking about a situation where the alarm goes off, the call goes out, and the teacher is taking the key and going outside the door and locking it. Ideally, it's already locked. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So that's for all those classroom doors. Now let's talk about 111, 112. You talked about the strike plate. I bet everybody knows what that is, but just in case, let's think about that. So when you open your door, whether at home or here, anywhere else, along the door jamb, if you will, where the door closes, there's a piece of metal and there's a hole in there that the door connects with. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
A strike plate. And so to make sure I'm clear, for this particular door at classroom 111, 112, when the door closed, the lock was not going into that strike plate.
Correct. It wasn't seating correctly.
It wasn't latching sometimes.
Exactly. Yes, sir.
And we've had doors like this at home, at work. It closes, and the doorknob can be locked, but you can just push it open because it wasn't sealing, wasn't seating.
That's correct.
Okay, and so that was the situation here.
Yes, sir.
And to make sure we're clear, there's testimony that the teacher in that classroom had reported to the administration, this door is not closing properly. It is not properly. This door, let me back up. The teacher had reported, this door is not closing properly. This door is not securing when we close it.
Yeah, at least on one occasion. I know we have records of how many times it was reported.
Thank you. Colonel, you talked about those ballistic shields, and you've made it so clear, and I'm glad you've stressed that based on your training, officers, we don't wait for shields. We don't wait for anything. You go in and stop the threat. Thank you for stressing that.
I don't care if you have flip-flops and wearing Bermuda shorts. It doesn't matter. You go in.
Amen. That said, do you believe we should be equipping all of our officers, every vehicle, with these ballistic shields to have another tool to use to protect the people of Texas and our children?
I think so. I think that's what we're going to do with resources you provided and allow, if approved, okay, by the, I don't want to get way out there, but if approved by the Legislative Budget Board and the leadership.
And you've seen the Lieutenant Governor almost immediately come out in favor of that, and of course I suspect that would be a unanimous matter here in the legislature. And you also mentioned breaching tools.
Yes, sir.
Is that something else you'd like to see us provide for officers?
Yes, sir. I'd like to see a go bag for every trooper that has, the shield that I discussed. It doesn't have to be, as I talked about before, it doesn't have to be a SWAT version, and certainly a breaching tools, and not just issued, but trained on them.
Colonel, thank you. And just one more question. And this has been addressed by a couple of senators, but I want to make sure I have it in one place. So 11:33, suspect begins shooting into classroom 111, 112 from the hallway. And then in the next few minutes, more than 100 rounds are fired. if I read that correctly. Is that right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And so we know, again, this is just so painful to read, to go through what happened. And then that was 11:33, over 100 rounds. And then over the next hour, there are some more shots fired that are documented.
Yes, sir.
And then at 12:50, an hour and almost an hour and 14 plus minutes, the classroom is liberated and the officers go in.
Yes, sir.
Colonel, this is hard. You know about the injuries. You know what you found when you went in. Senator Campbell talked about that golden hour. Is there any way to determine how different this outcome might have been had we been able to go in right away?
I can tell you the district attorney is committed to doing so, and she's enlisted, I said, a medical expert. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention his name, but Dr. S. Scott here in Travis County is well regarded to do that particular meticulous analysis to answer that question.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Just a point of clarification to Colonel or Director McCraw. On the timeline, you might have mentioned that the first 911 call, which happened after the grandmother was shot in the face, as we understand it, that is not on our timeline. Is that 11:21?
No, 11:21 was the text message from the subject to a CC, a juvenile in Germany, that said that he shot his grandmother in the face, and he's going to go shoot up an elementary school. That's 11:21. That was he was at 552 Diaz Street at that time.
And so, just point of clarification on that, because it's not on our timeline, but is 11:21, is that, am I hearing you, that was the 911 call that I think?
No, it was not. 11:21 was not the 911 call. That's when he announced just on text message that he just shot his grandmother and was going to go shoot up an elementary school.
Do we know what time the 911 call came in?
I do, or can get it, and I'll report it back to you if it's not right here. But
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for that clarification.
Okay, Senator Hinojosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of follow-up questions. Director McCraw, it seems like when I first read the timeline, there seems to be a complete failure of command and leadership at the site of the incident.
Yes, sir.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
It seems like nobody knew who was in charge. And the question is, why didn't DPS take command and in charge of the situation?
Well, first of all, the one that has command of the situation is the on-scene commander, the ranking official of the agency that has jurisdiction. That's by practice and doctrine. That local agency that had jurisdiction and that declared that they had command was the chief of police. The sheriff and the chief of police, the Uvalde Police Department, also deferred and said, yes, he is the on-scene commander. So by actions and deeds, he issued commands and had information and provided information and controlled the scene. One thing I left out, he was on the scene throughout the entire event. DPS, the Border Patrol, FBI, everyone that came in afterwards, U.S. Marshals that came in afterwards, is not the practice, the policy to take over anything, okay? Because first of all, you don't have self-directed action. One of the things that the experts you can ask them questions on is that in best practices, is there any situation where officers go in, okay, they're self-directed, they decide they want to be a part of for example, everyone wants to be on the entry team in the stack. And we get the DPS officer moves in and decides to, like our special.
Let me just.
Yes, sir.
You testified a while ago that you trained in this type of situation where lives are at stake, that you charge, even though you have shower shoes or flip-flops.
Mm-hmm.
But you all didn't do that in this situation. And I understand protocol, but it took over an hour to try to breach that door, over an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to use my military, but quite frankly, when you go into this type of situation, lives are at stake. If you really analyze the situation right away, and within 5-10 minutes, you know what's going on. You know that whoever's in charge of not making the right decisions, you got to take over and take command of the situation. I mean, we do that all the time in the military. I know that, and I don't see why you all shouldn't have taken command once you knew. You had DPS agents, DPS officers inside the hall that were pushing to breach the door in charge. I mean, to me, when lives are at stake, you have to be, and I don't care what the protocol is. If you have people there, officers who are well-trained and understand what the situation is, they need to take over a situation where you only have school district police officers who do not have the same type of training and experience. I mean, there's two different type of situations, or at least type of training we're talking about. I just, when I saw the timeline, I knew it was a complete failure. And if you all would have just taken over in charge, you would have been able to save lives in this type of situation. And I asked, I think I even texted you, whether or not DPS had authority by law to go in and assess a situation like this and take immediate action. When lives are
They don't have authority. No, sir, they don't have authority by law. I can tell you that one of the biggest problems that is reflected in the timeline, to your point, is not only the lack of leadership, but also the misinformation that's being provided. What officers were being told is the subject is contained, the chief is in the classroom or the office negotiating or talking to the subject. So everyone is treating it, that therefore comes in afterwards. You're in the hallway and you're looking at it and you're being told this. There's no reason to discount that. Now, certainly if you heard, well, wait a minute, we're getting 911 calls from children in the classroom. And we did note on the timeline, we got an officer, Officer Ruiz, whose wife called him and said she was been shot and she's dying. So certainly those things, and what happened to him was he tried to move forward into the hallway. He was detained and they took his gun away from him and escorted him off the scene.
But here, look, I understand that there was misinformation. And in firefights, this type of situation, there is a lot of confusion. Mm-hmm. But once you had DPS officers inside the hall, what they're seeing is not what they're being told.
Yeah. Well, what they saw, the first one was one of our troopers, the first one arrives at 11:42. And what she saw is numerous officers in the hallway, and enough to commit the stack or a containment, and after 2 minutes she left. So that's where our next officer on the scene was a PIO sergeant, okay, and he's the one that drove him to, drove Officer Ruiz to the scene, and he similarly went in and was under 2 minutes before he left. We had a Texas Ranger, was the fourth DPS officer on the scene. And when he arrived, he was there for 37 seconds. He saw the same thing. Everyone stacked up. We got plenty of officers. He went off to help the other students evacuate and teachers evacuate, duties as assigned. He later returned at about 12:16. When he returned, he also provided, because there was a request to cover the roof, so he got helicopter support. He tasked a special agent to get a UAV up, so he did some supporting thing, but there's no, at this point, we're now 12:16, and of course we had, I think, 4 other troopers that did the same thing. They went in the east hallway, looked, saw what was going on, and then left.
Well, there was a DPS officer in the hall who made the comment and asked, were the children inside?
Yes, sir.
And they said, yes, so we need to go in.
He said, if there's children, he made a declarative statement, yes, if there's children, we need to go in. We need to go in right now.
I just just from my experience, myself as a military person, and I know the training that police go through, this type of situation, in my humble opinion, is a complete failure by our law enforcement and the proper respond, and then DPS not taking over once they knew that the decisions that were being made from what you saw and what you heard, and I know it's misinformation, to take over the situation in order to save lives. I mean, that is the responsibility and that is the oath that we take, that law enforcement takes. In this type of situation, yes, some law enforcement might have been killed in charging in there. But that's why you sign up for the job. There's always a risk involved. And to me, I'm just very distraught when I read the timeline that if there being much quicker action, I don't want to blame anybody or Chief Arredondo. It was a complete failure among all the law enforcement agencies that were there, not able to take over and respond. But quite frankly, he didn't even know what the situation was. He wasn't talking to the shooter, and the shooter kept shooting at least 3 or 4 rounds. It just...
Hey, we had some...
It really questions the decisions that were made by the leadership and relying and with so much miscommunication as what you were looking and seeing and sensing, and all these children trapped in there. That was what really... I was just a complete failure.
Yeah, I described it as such. Absolutely a failure, and certainly antithetical to everything we've known, and as I said before, practice and preach for 2 decades.
And that's my point. That's why you should have just taken over. So something's wrong with the situation, and we need to make a decision now on what we know.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Campbell and then Senator West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just we're listening to events, how they unfolded on that horrendous day, but also looking for interventions and things we can do. We have a lot of strong obviously military-trained veterans. I think that we could have a volunteer program of veterans who are trained to carry and protect at least the perimeter of the schools. Do you have an opinion on that? I mean, I think it's a large, I ask you and then I think we have a large population of those who are, I mean, just like Senator Hinojosa, so well-trained in military experience with protection.
Yeah, I would certainly volunteer for that program if I was retired.
Yes.
When I retire.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
I would be the first in line.
Thank you, thank you, Director. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just a couple of questions. Director, an example, go to 1158-1201. Is that an example of some of the confusion that was going on in terms of who was in control there, who was the commander?
Yes. Good point, yes.
The fact is, it basically is saying that, and we say DPS SA, what is that, SA? San Antonio?
Yes, sir.
Special agent or what?
Yeah. Special agent, yeah.
Okay.
At 1158, 1156 at the PD channel recording. Again, it's critical that everybody let PD take a point on this. When they say PD, they were talking about ISD.
And then we have a special agent that replies, he's not my supervisor. What are you getting at 12.0113?
Yeah.
He's not my supervisor. What does that, help us understand that conversation?
He indicated he wanted to go clear more rooms, and the officer he talked to said, don't you think we should have a supervisor approve that? And to which he replied, he's not my supervisor. And of course, that agent went ahead and started clearing rooms and found a boy that had been hiding in a restroom. So he self-directed action.
When he said it's not my supervisor, who was he referring to? Do you know?
Well, the officer was talking about, well, don't we think we need a supervisor to approve? Well, his point was, he's not my supervisor. There's kids over there. I'm going to go over there.
I understand that. I'm just trying to understand the command structure at that point in time. Was he talking about the school chief or someone else, or do you know?
Yes, exactly. I mean, the response specifically from the officer or from the agent was, I want to be careful about here.
He says
it sounds like a hostage situation. Sounds like like a rescue. They should probably go in. And of course, to your point, indicates he wants to go clear more rooms. An unknown officer, at that point said, don't you think we should have a supervisor approve that? And of course, the agent is saying at this point, he's not my supervisor.
And so the question, are there any other instances of that in terms of it appears there's some sort of miscommunication in terms of the...
And we wanted to make sure that we had our agent there, which was any relevance that DPS officers in that building, wanted to make sure we had the body recorder statements and what time they entered, and that's the reason why that's included in here.
Okay, but does that indicate any type of breakdown in command structure right there?
Well, I think the whole thing was a breakdown in command structure.
No, let me be more
from the
specific.
beginning. And I think,
again, sir.
And if he would have
indicate, please. Does that indicate to you a breakdown in command structure? That particular segue, I should say.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay. Now let me ask another thing. Going down to 1247, when there was actually the breach, who led the breach? Was that Border?
BORTAC.
Okay, now, did the chief of police of the schools order them to go in, or did they came on the scene and did what was necessary in order to
They came on scene, and from the statements, you can see at some point, the chief acquiesces when they came. Of course, the chief asked for BORTAC, he asked for SWAT. When they arrived, then the issue became, the delay became about the key. And eventually, when they had that key situation resolved, is when the decision was made to go in.
And BORTAC made that decision? Do you know?
Sure. I'll just say, yeah, the decision was made to go in. I don't know that, and certainly BORTAC or that team made a decision to go in, but I don't know that the chief said, don't go in either.
Okay.
Because the chief was actually looking for the keys so they could go in.
So someone made a decision, finally made a decision to go in?
Yeah, when there's finally a tactical team and they finally have the keys, which they didn't need, the decision was to breach, and they did breach.
And the breach didn't occur until after we got the keys to open the door?
Until it didn't occur, although the key wasn't needed, the breach didn't occur until after they found a key that worked.
Last question. We've heard about the grandmother, about him shooting his grandmother in the face. Do we know her status, her medical status?
Well, we hope to. Unfortunately, she can't talk right now. It's very difficult, and she lost her jaw. But we're arranging for an interview with her, and she's been gracious to authorize that as long as her daughter's there. So we'll be doing that. If we haven't done it already, we'll be doing that here shortly. I can say that he waited for his grandfather to leave the house before.
Wow.
And he announced it. He said, that individual that I mentioned that he was talking to, he messaged back and said, well, I'm waiting for him to leave right now before I do it. And of course, after a period of time, he did leave, and he did do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Truman.
Senator Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Real quickly, I'm getting help from people, obviously, on text. They've mentioned something called the Texas Interoperability Channel Plan, and it's referenced that they had an option to go to direct interoperability channel, and that would have bypassed the problems we're having. Is that true or false?
I don't know if that's true or false.
You don't know the interoperability channel, is that designed specifically to go around problems?
Well, first, I don't know whether they, based on the threat assessment we did, that portable radios did not talk, as I indicated before, did not talk outside the school. So if you're saying there's an interoperability channel that would do that with the same radio system, I'm not aware of that.
So let me ask it this way. Was it a technology problem that they didn't communicate, or was it the director or the commander-in-chief not being trained that there was I'm told, a conduit in which officers can talk when there's problems?
Well, I'll start with first, the chief didn't have his radio with him initially, right? Secondly, based upon our assessment, the portable radios by the chief, because he uses the Uvalde system, the Uvalde PD system, the Uvalde PD officers, the sheriff's office, and DPS officers did not work inside that building. In fact, it didn't work until we got 10 feet away from the building.
So it's a technology. I'm trying to get to...
That's a technology, not an interoperability
Let me
issue.
back up. you know, my cell service doesn't have service some days. That's a different technology problem than, do we have a system in this state? Because we have appropriated money, we have forced the issue with Motorola versus whatever the other is to make all law enforcement officials, all law enforcement radios to talk to each other. Do we have a system across the board from city police to sheriff's departments to DPS to federal agents? Do we have a system that works together yet?
Yes, it's not in that building.
They don't work inside the building because it's
The radios to those agencies do not communicate.
Not enough signal. Not enough signal.
Not enough signal.
Okay, all right. Secondly, the initial 3 officers that met the individual before he headed down the hallway to the classrooms were shot at.
Yes, sir.
I think they were shot. Is that true?
Grazing wounds.
So I'll ask it this way. If the DPS were in charge and they were the 3 officers that met that individual coming down the hallway, would there have been a gun, a shootout, if you will, a distraction, as you've called it in the past, but would there have been more engagement from a DPS perspective had they been those 3 officers?
That's not fair for me to say. I would expect it to be the case. I think every chief would expect their officers to handle it differently in that regard. The doctrine suggests that absolutely, that's, you don't retreat based on that. And moreover, there was not just 3 officers immediately followed by another as many as 8 officers, but 4 on the other side. So there was more than enough officers right then when that happened.
Right then, if they had engaged with full force.
Yes, sir.
It's a pretty good chance that although the outside building was compromised, the inside of the office class. I mean, to me, it looks like that's where, along with all the other calamities and all the other noncompliance and all the other issues we've found, that's where we dropped the ball really for the last time before it happened.
The biggest chance was in that hallway, that 3 minutes before he got into the classroom. The biggest opportunity to save lives.
I understand.
Secondly, after that, the doctrine is, as we talked about before, you must isolate the subject. And that means you got to keep pressing. Then distract. They allow you to distract. You can do things that don't really, you can minimize risk to officers by distracting.
Did those 3 officers have bulletproof vests?
Did they have vests? Yes, sir.
They had bulletproof vests on?
Yes, sir. Every officer in there.
And they chose to effectively retreat. And I understand being shot at is not a pleasant experience, and I'm not armchair, but they could have engaged 3-on-1 and unloaded. There was no collateral damage potentially, I guess, if it's that narrow spot. It's kind of like shooting down a range.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Senator Hinojosa, I'll get to Senator Zaffarini first, and she'd ask first. So Senator Zaffarini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel McGraw, a 4th grade teacher at Robb Elementary, posted that a few months before May 24th, the district had adopted a silent alarm system, but the school personnel had never drilled with anything other than an audible system, and that after May 24th, that at least half the staff never saw the silent alarm that was rung on May 24th, but that half the teachers did not see it. And he also noted that the district's silent alarm system has no backup warnings, and that the first teacher was shot 4 minutes after the alarm was sent. Are you familiar with the use of the silent alarm system at Robb?
No, I'm not familiar with it, unless it's a Raptor system that we're talking about. I'm not familiar with it.
Well, this teacher is urging that silent alarm systems be opposed because they do not work. Do you have any advice about the use of silent alarms?
Well, what I do is recommended one of the recommendations in our threat and vulnerability assessment was to have a mass alert system throughout the campus. So that's one thing we do recommend, and I'm sure that other experts will recommend it. More importantly, experts that will come behind will recommend it as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hinojosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there were reports about the shooter making statements in social media prior to the incident.
Yes, sir.
And I know we have fusion centers in certain regions of the state. Would a fusion center would help in that type of situation to pick up the warnings about going to a school and shooting it up?
I'm sorry, Chairman.
You know, there was social media reports
Right.
that the shooter
Yes, sir.
had put out warnings and told other people that he was planning to go
Yes,
to the
sir.
school and shoot at the school.
Yes, sir. Yeah, he did send messages and a chat to a number of people on that very day.
And my question was just, and I don't know the answer. We have fusion centers in different regions of the state, not all over the state. Would a fusion center would have been of help or be able to pick up those type of messages or warnings?
Those were private messages in either a four-person chat or a direct messaging based on the social media application, whether it's Instagram, Facebook. You've got so really they would not have the ability to pick it up without a court or authorized subpoena to be able to get access to it. So they wouldn't be a timely access to it because it's not public information. They couldn't use the internet to scour, for example, someone posted publicly those particular statements. They wouldn't find that just by searching the internet. It's something that would have to require a court or a subpoena to be able to get that from the company.
Thank you for answering my question, clarifying that.
Senator Kokors.
Thank you. Director McCraw, thank you for your long testimony today and what you have revealed. Thank you to the members for your exhaustive and very good questions. When I look at your timeline and how many rounds were fired off, a question arose that ARs are not always easy to handle, especially knowing how to load them and changing clips and so forth. In all your interviews, do you know if he had been practicing his shooting since he purchased the gun, and had he been training on how to do rapid fires and so forth? Have y'all discovered anything in your interviews about that?
Well, as mentioned earlier, he didn't drive. He had to get someone else to, he didn't drive. He'd have to get someone else to drive him. He did request someone to take him for a range, and that didn't occur. And of course, he didn't buy the firearms until May 16th. So he was not trained. He hadn't had a lot of practice with it. So regardless of what he was doing in his room, it wasn't, he wasn't on a field or a range or something like that in terms of perfecting his skills.
Thank you.
Okay, I had a couple of questions. This would help clarify something for me that I had heard early, and we all know there were a lot of misinformation early on in the reports. But when you call 911 in Uvalde, does it go to the sheriff's office? Is that where the 911 center is, or does it go to the police department?
The police department. In Uvalde, it's the police department.
Okay. Because I had heard, it was the sheriff's department, and they were getting the word to the sheriff's deputies and stuff, but not to the police department. So you're saying it was the police department that got the 911 call?
Yes, sir.
From the kids and teachers and stuff like that?
Yes, sir.
But they could not convey that information to the officers, the school officer that was inside the building?
Well, we know we could only find one thus far. There may be more. One officer that heard the reports on the dispatch. The dispatch then put it out and broadcast it. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it was a lot of people talking at the same time, bits and parts. He said, "Hey, say again, say again." And so we know at least one officer had that information based upon that 1203 phone call from Chloe.
Okay. That clears that up. So when the police department gets that information from 911, I would assume that's immediately conveyed to the school police.
Yes, sir, everybody. In fact, the school police uses the Uvalde Police Department channel, their radio system. So they're in communication, and the sheriffs, in fact, everybody, including DPS and the Border Patrol, are monitoring, what they have the ability to monitor, and this is one of the things that Senator Perry is talking about. Yeah, it's interoperable in the sense that we can listen to each other's conversations.
Okay, different question. Dollars to purchase those weapons and ammunitions. He just turned 18.
Yes, sir.
Do we know where he got that much money? Was he working a regular job?
Well, for all we've been able to determine thus far is that he's saved that money over a long period of time working at fast food restaurants. And we've had interviews. We haven't been able to find anything else. There's been talk about odd work, odd jobs with a grandfather or something like this, or there's lots of things, but we've been able to identify is that he had money related to that he didn't spend. He lived with grandparents. He didn't drive, didn't have a vehicle. And that money was used to open that bank account.
Okay, thanks. Third, and hopefully my last question, the numerous members asked questions related to the latch. Did it lock? Did it not lock? Could it have been locked? Could it have not locked? Was the strike plate not lined up with the, I guess you call it the plunger, which it wasn't? But also, when we did a Zoom call with you, my staff, and some of your staff a few days back, you had photographs of it was a magnetic plate.
Yes, sir.
That you stick on top of the strike plate.
Yes, sir.
To keep the plunger from going in the hole.
Yes, sir.
It's a convenience device, so the door doesn't automatically lock whenever it closes.
Yes, sir.
You found that in the school, or did you find multiple?
Well, there are multiple ones throughout the school. That's because that's what they'll do. It's convenient for the students to come back. They go to the restroom, they can come back in without having to be let in.
Did y'all check all the doors to see how many there were, or?
How many there were? Our threat